Another great card. There's 13 fights on this card so far booked for the second fight island card. I mean, really, it's the 5th one overall. And Matt, kicking us off in the flyweight division, we have Bulldog Bruno Silva taking on the former Fight Nights Global Flyweight Champion Tagir Ulanbekov. And Matt, I know a lot of people really excited for this debut out of the Russian fighter Tagir Ulanbekov. I mean, this is a main training partner of Khabib Nurmagomedov, coming at you from Eagles MMA in Dagestan. We've seen Khabib in his corner before. We've seen Islam Makhachev and crew. And what can we tell you about him? I mean, man, very, very long, rangy striker, especially for 125 pounds. I'd like to see these guys face off. Can't wait for that this week. We've also seen an excellent ground game from him. Some really high pressure as well. If he has to push things up against the cage, he can do so. If he has to get a trip takedown, he will. And once he's on top in guard, it could be from anywhere, but even from full guard, he can definitely do some slippery things. So a guy to really look forward to at 25, a long-awaited UFC debut from Tagir Ulanbekov. And opposite him, Bruno Silva. I mean, what can I say about him? I can tell you this, that if you had to find a guy that could emulate the style of a fighter out of a Pitbull Brothers camp, Bruno Silva would be one of those guys. He's going to pick up a couple of things in the gym from Patricio, from Patricky, or from Henry Cejudo, having that main coach in Eric Albarracin. And that's the perfect guy to have in your corner for a guy like Bruno Silva. Now, we've seen it so far in his UFC tenure. I mean, he got submitted by Kalataha in his debut, and that's where his record gets a little bit sketchy because I have the no contest there. Some sites consider it a loss. He got finished by Taha. After the fight, Taha tested positive for a possible PED masker. So some sites with a no contest, some sites considering it a loss. For Bruno Silva, it was a fight up a weight class at 135 pounds. So he pops down to 125. He took on my guy, David Dvorak. And listen, we pumped the tires of David Dvorak before that fight. Bruno Silva came to fight, but it was David Dvorak winning rounds 2 and rounds 3. Silva looked good in the first round. Silva looked good in the fight. He definitely wasn't out of it. And it's a totally different beast in Tagir Ulanbekov in this fight, Matt. I'm excited about this one. I always say it, and I should have said it at the start. Flyweight never die, but this is a great one.
You stole the words right out of my mouth. Pride Never Die was kind of like our parents' generation, if you will, version of holding on to their nostalgia. But Flyweight Never Die is kind of our new school version of it, I guess, because every flyweight fight that the UFC does put on, now I understand, they significantly cut their roster. So right now, there is only about 15 flyweight fighters in the UFC's roster for them. But those are the best 15 guys out there, really, and they always put on exciting performances. Doesn't really matter who you put in that title shot category, or really who you have fighting. Flyweights are always going to deliver. This fight I'm really excited for because you have the strengths of Ulanbekov are kind of the weaknesses of a Bruno Silva. Not that Bruno Silva's not a great fighter by any means. I know he's 0-2 in the UFC, but that record is a little bit misleading, like you had mentioned. I mean, Dvorak, losing a decision to him, not the end of the world. It's really a growing experience. And the Taha loss, I'll be honest, that wasn't a really great performance from Bruno Silva. But again, moving up in weight class, having your opponent potentially get flagged for steroid, there was just a lot of odd variables around that fight.
He got rocked a fair bit in that fight and dropped a number of times, but he always kept popping back up, trying to wrestle, trying to chain things together. He did have success until he got submitted.
Exactly. And Ulanbekov has... Peter Yan's kind of the guy who I always think of when I think of this. He's got sprawl-ready hips. Like, the second you make any kind of motion towards him, his hips can just kind of flex right down to the ground. So if you do go for any kind of lazy double leg, any lazy single leg, any lazy takedown or entries, he can basically just whip your head down to the ground. Prime Hector Lombard style somewhat. Not with that kind of force, but still, like, he will sprawl you down. And the grappling from Ulanbekov, like we had mentioned, he's really good at floating on top, too. Charles Oliveira, another guy who that kind of reminds me of, where he's never really stuck in a stagnant position. It's not like he's in half guard and then he moves to side control and he tries to advance to mount. It's all kind of fluid from him on top. So if he is able to get on top of Bruno Silva, I think it's going to cause him a lot of trouble.
And it's very interesting because if you look at it for Tagir Ulanbekov winning that belt against Vartan Asatrine, he looked great in that fight. His striking was on point. Like I said, I mean, his opponent, big cut by the eye and so on and so forth until he earned that belt. Then there was a lot of time off, about a year, and he took on a very familiar name, especially from the Fight Nights global scene, but from the Kazakh MMA scene, as well as the UFC now, in Zhalgas Shumagulov, who had a pretty decent fight against Halim Paiva in his debut. Some people thought maybe he won that fight. But still, Ulanbekov loses that one, majority decision. So what does he do? He comes back and rings off 3 big wins in 2019 with Guerrilla FC. Wins the first one by decision, the other 2 by submission. rides it out, takes some time off. I know he spent some time in the States training ahead of this one. If you look at the old Instagrams ahead of his UFC debut with Silva, he's got a little bit of Umar Nurmagomedov in there that you might recognize from signing to the UFC. And Usman Nurmagomedov, who just signed with Bellator, the undefeated prospect. So some interesting stuff there. But again, some of Dagestan's finest fighters and some of the lower weight classes from 55 down, really putting things together. Now, the one thing that does scare me about this fight, when we bring in the odds, you've got Ulanbekov coming in here a minus 370 favorite at this point. Open as a minus 455. Bruno Silva coming in, again, another big underdog. That's going to be the theme for a lot of this card. But if you look at Bruno Silva, he opened as a plus 355. He's now a plus 300 underdog. So, I mean, there's some money coming in on Bruno Silva, and actually that line dropped quite a bit for Ulanbekov right off the hop, but it's since kind of rebounded a little bit for Bruno Silva. I think the odds are ridiculous. I think this is actually a lot more competitive fight than those odds might actually jump out at the page and say to you. I mean, look at the fight between Josh Culibao and Charles Jourdain this past weekend. That was one where you thought, geez, those odds don't make any sense. This is the same one. So before I even bring in a pick or anything, to me it's a fade just because those odds, they're just way too skewed. Bruno Silva certainly has a path to victory in this fight. If we look over on Tapology to the total votes, again, I really like Tagir Ulanbekov, but out of a limited sample size, 611 total votes, 92% going with Ulanbekov, 55% saying he's going to win by submission, a further 38% saying he can win by decision. I think that's totally possible. I think Tagir Ulanbekov has a great shot at a submission win in this fight. I just think that those odds on Bruno Silva are way too skewed, and to me it's a fade, but I will go with Tagir Ulanbekov.
I do agree with a lot of what you said. My only problem is I don't see a path to victory for Bruno Silva. Because when I think about this fight in my head, I don't think Bruno can outstrike Ulanbekov for 3 rounds. I don't think he can out-wrestle him. I don't think he can out-grapple him. I think he can do those things for short periods of time, but I think once Ulanbekov is able to kind of mix in his own wrestling attack with his striking, it's going to be a lot for Silva to try to focus on at once. And if he is able to score some of those takedowns early, I think it's just going to open up his striking as the fight goes on, because then you're going to have in the back of Silva's mind, okay, now I have to watch for the takedown, but I've also got this really dangerous striker in front of me. And we've seen as of late, like 125ers they can crack. And that was kind of the story for the longest time of, flyweights don't finish. That's not true anymore. Every flyweight fight tends to be a finish nowadays. I mean, Devison Figueiredo, look at him. He's their champ, and he just, knocks everybody out. So, really exciting time for the flyweight division. Like Craig said, flyweight never die, but I'm going to Ulanbekov.
Matt, both of us agreeing the win going to Tagir Ulanbekov. I'm really looking forward to this, Matt. It's a great card. You're not going to want to miss the rest of the predictions on the card, including an extended look on our main event between two really tough outs. Up a weight class at 135, you've got Marlon Moraes taking on Cory Sandhagen. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it. Really low-key fight, Matt, at 135 pounds. We have Tracy Cortez that a lot of people might be familiar with from her time on Dana White's Contender Series. She picked up a big win over Maria Agapova. A lot of people really down on Maria Agapova these days, but she'll bounce back. And Tracy Cortez, for what it's worth, she wins that fight on Contender Series. Very emotional moment for her, getting the call, getting the contract. Comes back out, takes on Vanessa Mello, and moves up to 135 pounds. So that's probably going to be your future home for Tracy Cortez. So we saw her look great in that fight against Vanessa Mello. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it there. Now she's taking on a really tough out in Stephanie Egger, who's coming in on short notice, replacing 2-0 Bia Malecki. Fortis MMA's own Bia Malecki. I mean, we saw her with Cheyenne Bays in her corner the last time she came out over in a big fight at 135 pounds, and she won that fight. Now, Malecki's out, Egger's in. What do we know about Stephanie Egger? I mean, Stephanie Egger, so far, black belt in judo that she earned many, many years ago. And if you look down through her total record outside of the cage in MMA, because she's a late bloomer, I mean, 5'1" at 32 years of age, what has she really done, Craig? I mean, she's medaled and competed at, listen, you pick the tournament for judo, she's been in it, and she's medaled in it. And since then, really rounded out her game. Blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. She's an ADCC European champ. She competed at the 2019 ADCC World Championships. Lost in the finals to Gabby Garcia, who outweighs her by probably 100 pounds. And it went into overtime in that one.
Lost on points. No shame in that.
You know that Stephanie Egger is good at the takedowns, good at Jiu-Jitsu. And don't just take my word for it. Go back and watch some of Stephanie Egger's fights. And the thing that I like before I let you go off, Matt, is the fact that Stephanie Egger does something that we actually saw, and this is a poor example, but it ties in at 135. Ronda Rousey was so good at throws above the waist. She could really just ragdoll her opponents around. Stephanie Egger, a lot taller and thinner than Rousey, but she's able to do a lot of the same things. Also, her striking quite good, and I know you're going to talk about one of her major wins, but her striking is very good. She can mix in the kick. She throws nice punches down the middle. She does leave herself susceptible. She will throw some wild looping shots, but she can stick behind the nice jab. Apart from that, Stephanie Egger, well-rounded enough, but it's that judo and jiu-jitsu background that she has that I think matches up very well against Tracy Cortez.
I agree 100%, and we're not to take anything away from Tracy Cortez, because she's a really well-rounded mixed martial artist. We saw that in the Agapova fight, we saw that in the Mello fight, and I thought the Mello fight was a really important one for her, because yes, Vanessa Mello is probably not the best MMA fighter you're ever going to find, but for Tracy Cortez to not only move up in weight, but to move up in weight, and then fight someone who misses weight at the weight class that's above your natural one, if you will, that was really impressive, and Tracy Cortez has that Volkanovski kind of style of game where it's whatever you're going to do, I'm just going to do the opposite because I'm so well-rounded that I'm assuming whatever your weakness is, I'll at least be average at it, so I'll be better than you at it. And Cortez is good at using her wrestling. She's great at... We talk about this a lot, too, when you're comparing Egger to Ronda Rousey, where in women's MMA, there is a lot of head and arm throws. Judo's a lot more important, I guess, than wrestling is in women's MMA. But when you look at Tracy Cortez, her wrestling style is the exact opposite of Egger's because she is going to go for the more traditional kind of double leg, single leg. Will work a lot in the clinch, and that's what kind of worries me in this fight because I think it's fair to say Tracy Cortez is the more well-rounded out of the two. She can wrestle, she's good at jiu-jitsu, she's good at striking. There's not a massive weakness to her game. The issue, though, is can someone who is the smaller fighter use that skill advantage against someone who is more of a specialist, who's a little bit bigger? I think in the clinch, which is where Cortez has a lot of her success, might be a bit of her downfall because Egger, and what I was going to bring up, when you go through Egger's past record, and we do this a lot, well, not even a lot, we do this for every fighter, you look through the past record, kind of see the level of competition. A lot of people making their UFC debut have fought a lot of those 0-0s, 1-1s, 0-1s. Egger fought semi-decent talent over at Rise, and you probably heard the name King Reina before. She beat her in one of her first fights, well, one of her first 6 MMA fights, so that's a really impressive thing to do when you go over there. Fight not only one of Risen's better women's fighters, but one of kind of the faces of their organization, or at least at the time. Put on an impressive performance. Her grappling is really good. And she is great at going for the throws and then going immediately into a submission. So she'll hit you with that arm throw. If you do leave an arm out, she'll attack that. If she can get to your back, she'll do the same. So stylistically, this is a really interesting matchup because it's going to come down to, will the size and strength of Egger kind of outweigh the skills of Cortez?
And this is where I really like it because if you look at Tracy Cortez's record, again, she's fought really good competition as well. And like you said, very well-rounded. She's a much more technical striker with her boxing than you're going to see from Stephanie Egger with the long looping kind of shots. But again, if you look at it for Tracy Cortez, Monica Medina, big win. Karen Cedillo, 1-0. Erin Blanchfield, a split decision win at 3-0. Then you beat Agapova, that's a good win. Then you beat Vanessa Mello. For Egger, and we had talked about it, I mean, you look at her debut was against Judith Ruiz, who at this point, 6-5, she just made her Bellator debut in the last calendar year. All right, but Judith Ruiz, pretty good name on the European scene. Then she beat Mara Romero Barella, who, I get it, just got cut by the UFC, but still, that's really good competition to be taking on the regional scene, especially in your second fight. First and second fight, you had mentioned the fight against Reina, and this is where, to me, it gets very interesting. I think this fight stylistically matches up a lot like a fight that we had recently with a name that one of these fighters has faced, not in MMA, but has faced in the past. Stephanie Egger, when she was competing at ADCC, took on Yulia Stoliarenko back in the 2019 World Championships. That's where I think Yulia Stoliarenko, a lot of people might have known her from The Ultimate Fighter when she came back after some fights away from the UFC and just off the cuff, they give her Yana Kunitskaya. I could see the fight between Stoliarenko-Kunitskaya ending up similarly to Cortez and Egger, where Kunitskaya, what she did was just pressured the whole fight and kept Stoliarenko up against the cage. Stoliarenko had some spots where she was trying to fish for some things, wasn't really able to get it moving and going. Tracy Cortez fights a lot like that. A lot of pressure, a lot of cage presence. She can get the back, she can get on top. She's really, really physically stronger than a lot of her opponents. And I could see that happening in this one. Again, Stephanie Egger, she's fought good competition. She has that pedigree, training at a buddy gym over in Switzerland, so there's that. And then again, you have Tracy Cortez coming out of Fight Ready in Arizona, one of the premier gyms that we've seen really kind of spurt out of Arizona. And there's a lot, I mean, MMA Lab and so on and so forth. The list goes on there. Overall, I look at these odds. I'm a little perplexed, but I'm not. I mean, Tracy Cortez opened a -305 favorite. She's now a -255. If you look at Stephanie Egger, open a +255, now a +205. You look over on Tapology, similar to our first fight between Tagir Ulanbekov and Bruno Silva. At a 560 total votes, 91% going with Cortez, 89% predicting a decision. I think that's the safe pick. As much as we talked about the fighter on the right, I'm going with the fighter on the right here, Matt. I think Stephanie Egger is going to be able to get the win in this one. I think she's going to surprise a lot of people. Can I see a path to victory for Tracy Cortez? Well, of course I can. She's a blue chip prospect in the UFC, 6 years younger, with 2 more fights in her pro career, for whatever that's worth. But I really like Stephanie Egger popping in on short notice. A much different test than Bia Malecki. You're getting ready for Bia Malecki. What are you getting ready for? The longest, rangiest striker, apart from maybe Penny Kianzad at 135 pounds in the UFC's women's bantamweight division. I think Stephanie Egger, while she is long like we talked about, poses totally different challenges for Tracy Cortez. And for those reasons, I think Stephanie Egger is going to be able to get the win here.
Okay, I think you laid out a really good argument, but I don't agree. I think Tracy Cortez is going to get the win, but I'm going to side with you on one thing. Because of the odds, I'd put money on Stephanie Egger, even though I think Tracy Cortez is going to win. She's way too big of an underdog in this fight for Tracy Cortez, who I'm a big believer in. You have to prove that you're a favorite. Not only that, okay, my level of competition might be a little bit better than yours, and now we're fighting. You need to prove in the UFC with UFC caliber opponents, unless you're like a Michael Chandler. I'm not gonna make him fight UFC level guys. But with Tracy Cortez, she hasn't proven to me that she deserves to be a 2.5, almost 3-1 favorite over somebody yet. So maybe if you were looking to put money down, Egger's not a bad choice, but I just think Cortez is gonna be able to kind of outgrind her. Cortez is just going to do the same thing. Rinse and repeat. Get into the clinch. Go to the cage. Mix it up. Go for a takedown. If I don't get it, go back to striking. She's going to make Egger work constantly, and she's not going to keep it in the same range throughout the fight. I think if it is very heavily in the clinch, Egger might be able to go for a throw, get a submission, but I'm going to say Cortez probably by submission.
Matt?
Or probably by decision. Goodness, sorry. That's my bad.
We're going to disagree on the pick. You're going with Tracy Cortez. I'm going to go with the UFC debutante in Switzerland's own Stephanie Egger. I'm really looking forward to this card. We got a great main event at bantamweight between Marlon Moraes and a really tough out in Cory Sandhagen, so you're not going to want to miss that. You keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. If you're an MMA fan, you should be excited about this fight. And Matt, last weekend, we got everybody amped up about Jordan Williams and Nasruddin Imavov. Well, if that was our fight of the weekend that you have to watch, this is the fight of the upcoming weekend. Giga Chikadze, Omar Morales is a fight that's going to fly under the radar, and I see Matt giving me a weird look, but there's reason to get excited about this one because you have Giga Chikadze coming out of King's MMA. In his last fight, he fought Erwin Rivera, who's coming in from Titan FC, moving up a weight class on very short notice, and Giga Chikadze got the win, and he turned his output up as the fight went on. It was a decent fight, and I guess there was a bit of a drop between the second and third, and Matt, I know that's something that we're going to kind of dive into a little bit later, and for Omar Morales, this is a guy that coming in, he's an older guy. A lot of people were sleeping on him in his last fight against Gabriel Benitez. Both of these guys came the Contender Series route in a way because for Giga Chikadze, fought early on in the Contender Series, lost by submission to Austin Springer in a fight where he was having some success. He even had some success where I didn't think he would, maybe on the ground. He was going for submissions, but ultimately ended up getting submitted in the third round of that fight. For Omar Morales, came in against Harvey Park, the former LFA lightweight champ, finished him, and then in his last 2 fights, a win over the maestro, Dun Hyun Ma, and after that, the win over Gabriel Benitez, who's a really tough fighter to look good against. I mean, a guy with whipping leg kicks, a guy fighting in a style that's very tough to try and get through to and really land with a lot of authority, and Omar Morales able to do that. So the striking from Hard Knocks 365 or Sanford MMA from Omar Morales, oh, by the way, now he has to defend the honor of his teammate, Erwin Rivera, Chikadze's last opponent. And for Giga Chikadze, so far in the UFC, Matt, and I know this is what you're going to touch on, he's looked good, but we haven't really seen glimmers or glimpses of that glory kickboxer that we know in Giga Chikadze. And not every glory kickboxer is created equal like Israel Adesanya. So overall in this fight, I think it's very entertaining. 2 primary strikers. You got the boxing of Morales, you get the kickboxing of Giga Chikadze. Does it make for an interesting fight?
It really does, but I do think we can simplify this fight to a certain degree. I think this fight is going to go kind of similar to the Rivera fight. It's just you have a much more skilled version of Erwin Rivera and a much bigger version of him as well. Because we saw in the Rivera fight, he was much smaller than Chikadze, but he was able to push him backwards constantly. And Omar Morales, you know what his style is. And let's be honest, his style at 155 is going to be his style at 145. It's not like we're going to see a drastic change out of him. Maybe his cardio could dip a little bit, but that would be the only thing I'd be worried about. But you know you're just going to get a lot of that forward pressure. Really good boxing combinations too. He's got a lot of power in both hands. He's not afraid to go to the body. But this fight is just going to be a lot of Omar Morales moving forward. And then I think it comes down to how could Chikadze respond to that forward movement? Can he start throwing those big knees like we saw against Rivera when Rivera would kind of duck in to try to close the distance? And then Chikadze, by the end of that fight, and it was something that he progressively got better at as the fight went on, was okay, I can time his ducks, I can time his head movement, and really make him pay for it. Kind of like in UFC 4, if you duck the wrong way when you think like a right head kick's coming, and a left one comes, and you just get flatlined, even though you've knocked down your opponent 7 times. I sound salty because it happened last night. But Chikadze is really going to have to make Omar pay for that forward movement. And like you had mentioned, every video we do about Giga Chikadze, we mention his striking acumen, how he was a former glory kickboxer. He was a former glory kickboxer, but I think we might have to start downplaying that just a little bit because, like you had mentioned, not every glory kickboxer is the same. We have some guys come into the UFC, like an Adesanya, of course, who they're striking so much better than everyone else's. Of course, you can mention the whole glory thing. With Chikadze, he's a really good striker, but he kind of waits and picks his moments. You'll see like 3 minutes of inactivity, and then he'll go really hard for about 30 seconds, kind of see what he can do to his opponent if he can land some of those damaging shots, and then I'll kind of go back into his kind of downloading position again, if you will. He'll just kind of sit back, wait to see what his opponent does, and the problem with Chikadze, that really low output does get him, it bites him in fights because we've seen him. A lot of his wins are by split decision where he shouldn't really be going 2 decisions with these guys when you think about what his striking is able to do. I mean, Brandon Davis, you know what you're going to get. He's a tough guy. He's kind of good at everything. Chikadze should have blown him out of the water, but it was a really, really close fight just because Chikadze, he doesn't have the highest output in the world and allows his opponents to kind of creep their way into the fight. So I do think this is a super fun fight. It's probably going to end in stoppage no matter which way it goes. I'm going to go out on that limb already because just the clash of styles, I should say, makes for that. It's either Morales walks into a massive shot of Chikadze or he's able to walk him down, really make Giga work, and force him to go left and right. If you can get him up against the cage, you're going to really take away from that movement and that footwork that Chikadze is somewhat known for. And if you can push him up against the cage, Omar should be able to start landing with his boxing, but it's really that 1 or 2. I don't see this being a competitive fight for both guys on the inside. I think it is going to be either Morales kind of goes out there, not steamrolls, but he goes out there, really gets his boxing, closes the range in this fight, and starts to put his hands on Chikadze, or Chikadze is able to stay on the outside, kind of kick apart Morales as it continues.
Now, I think it is a very, very close fight, and you kind of no-sold something at the start that I wanted to delve into more, and it's the fact that a lot of people might not be familiar with this, but inside baseball, with Fight Night Picks, when I do up the graphics, I put an asterisk next to somebody if they've changed weight class. I don't change it if their country's changed or anything else, but if they've changed weight classes, I will do that. You can't see it under Omar Morales' right forearm, but there's an asterisk back there. Just believe me, because he's fought his career at 55. He's 34 years old, and now he's deciding to go down to featherweight. I worry about that a lot. Now, you might think that that's strange because he's only a couple years older than Chikadze. He's an inch shorter, but Chikadze's been fighting at 45.
He's just natural.
And he's thinner, so I don't worry about it as much. Whereas if you look at Omar Morales, not just in that picture, but go on to the IG where you're going to get IG bod. You're going to get you're going to get beach bod. Omar Morales carries around a fair bit of muscle. It is something of concern. And again, I mean, Matt, you talked about it in terms of output. Omar Morales, not so bad in the UFC. And like I said, Chikadze's kind of taken some, maybe not full rounds off, but he's taken minutes off in fights that I worry about. You can do that more in boxing and even kickboxing. You can't do that so much in the 3 5-minute round fight that is a professional MMA fight, unless you're fighting in some weird spot where it's 2 5s or 1 5 if it's an Invicta. Phoenix
10 and 2 5s?
Or 10 and 2 5s, I guess, but still. With Omar Morales, I worry about that a little bit. And in terms of the odds in this fight, I was actually surprised. Omar Morales opened a minus 135. Money dropped hot, heavy on him very early on. He got as far as a minus 220. And then it shot back up by way of Chikadze. And at this point, Omar Morales sits a minus 145 favorite or so. Now, you look at it for his opponent, and I mean, Matt, Giga Chikadze, maybe we haven't seen the best out of him so far. Open plus 115, he's now a plus 120. If we have a look over on Tapology to the total votes, 654 votes, 56% going with Omar Morales, 80% saying he's going to win by decision. I would think a lot more people would think maybe finish for Omar Morales if he can get in close. I know Giga Chikadze, it's not like he's getting knocked out in the UFC, but he hasn't really fought the same level of striker as an Omar Morales. I'm just so worried about this weight cut and the change in weight. And I say late, he's still young in his MMA career, 34 years old, but this late in age in your career to make that change, I do worry about it. I'm going to side with King's MMA's Giga Chikadze. Might not be the most confident pick. This is probably one of those fights where you just sit back, have a pop, a little bit of popcorn, enjoy it. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm going with Giga Chikadze in this one.
I see where you're coming from, but I just think Omar Morales is going to be able to get it done. You look at him at 155, and yeah, he's a pretty thick dude, but when he fought Gabriel Benitez, a career 145er, he wasn't that much bigger than him. I mean, he was bigger, but barely, like, whatsoever. He's slightly more muscular, but frame-wise, he does match up with a lot of guys at 145 better than he does with the guys at 155, and I do think that is the cause for his weight drop, is because at 155, what's the division dominated by? Either world-class strikers or really dominant wrestlers. Whereas in 145, it's a much more of a strikers division. So I wouldn't worry as much about the weight cut for Morales. I do think his style is going to be pretty much the same. I think the cardio is going to be there. I think the output's going to be there. And this could be one of those fights where I might agree with Craig. Chikadze might win by the end of it, but I do think the output is enough of a concern that Morales can, even if he's losing the rounds, he's landing a lot more strikes, so the judges might say he wins the round. So I'm going to say Morales by controversial decision.
Matt going Morales. I'm going Giga Chikadze. I'm really looking forward to this one, and we've got a great card coming up. Lots of sleeper fights, but we got a great main event at the top of the bantamweight division. Aljamain Sterling's not going to like it, but you've got Marlon Moraes taking on Cory Sandhagen. You're not going to want to miss that. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, and as we always say, let's get into it. Really good job of matchmaking this fight, and it's an interesting one because we have the royal fighter Ali Al-Khazi from Jordan making his second trip to the octagon, taking on primetime Tony Kelley, who's also making his second time out. And Matt, I mean, you look at it, for Tony Kelley, short notice debut against Kai Kamaka III back earlier on this summer. Now, those two fought at featherweight, going to be dropping down to 135, taking on Al-Khazi, who fought at 35 his first time out against Irwin Rivera. Really close fight, ended up losing it by split decision, and I did see a lot of people having it for Jordan's own Al-Khazi. Personally, I had it for Rivera, but we could go back and watch that fight and debate all we want. But on the feet, it was an interesting fight, but overall, that Kung Fu Sanda background of Ali Al-Khazi, that's the thing that really makes a lot of his fights interesting. He has very different and awkward takedowns. He has very different awkward striking. He tends to hold one arm out quite far and then he'll strike. It's something that you don't see very often. And for Tony Kelley, the guy was a straight up wild man this debut against Kai Kamaka. And the thing that made that very interesting, I mean, Tony Kelley coming out of Dement Bros in Shreveport, Louisiana. He's got that boxing background, but he's a really well-rounded fighter. We've seen him training all the way up through with Mark De La Rosa, Andrea Lee coming out of that camp as well. So some interesting names. And Tony Kelley, for what it's worth, he had a really long layoff between fights. And I say that because one meant a lot and one did not. He had a loss to Kevin Aguilar many moons ago with LFA. We're talking 5 years. Plus, before that, a big win over Levi Mowles. And he also, on his record, had a very interesting win over Jordan Winsky. And we're talking Mowles and Winsky, pretty hot prospects to this point. And for Ali Al-Khazi, maybe not the same level of competition or recognizable names that you might know on the regional scene. And he fought for Brave too, which, I mean, there's all kinds of fight tape out there that you can see. But where Ali Al-Khazi's story got very interesting is during this whole pandemic, he just decided, you know what? My best opportunity to get the UFC. That's my goal. I'm going to move myself and my family to the States. And where could I go? So he goes to Fortis MMA, trains for a little bit. Then for his fight, and he was just hoping, hey, if I go to Vegas from Texas, maybe I'll get a good opportunity. Well, it worked out for him. So he's training at 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, getting ready for that fight against Irwin Rivera. And I thought it was a pretty good showing. I mean, you're coming in on short notice, you get a big opportunity like that, and it's not a bad fight. It was a really fun fight if you get the chance to go back and watch it. For Tony Kelley, the fight against Kamaka, It's like they would say over in the UK, it was just straight up bangers and then some mash. And it was a lot of fun. So you've got really good styles coming together in this one. I mean, maybe the records might not jump off the page at you, but this is a fight that you can't miss. And I expect a lot of action. What are you thinking here?
I think this is a really exciting fight. I like how you set it up. Tony Kelley, like you had mentioned, his UFC debut. It's not often your debut is also the fight of the night, but Tony Kelley has that distinction. Really good footwork, good boxing too. A guy who's good at moving on the outside will switch his stances, and I think that's a really important part of this fight because when you look at what Al-Qaisi does well, he throws those wild looping shots, and yes, if they do land, they are going to hit really hard. Here's the problem though. When you have a guy who's known for throwing these wild looping shots, just kind of like overhands and hooks, not a guy who works behind his jab, can switch stances, throw straight from either side. Not that Kelley's that like Max Holloway level of a striker, but he is a guy who can use both stances, can use his boxing quite well, and will throw in some kicks. I think the footwork's really important, though, because as Al-Qaisi is going to throw those looping shots to try to clinch up, if Tony Kelley can keep his feet moving throughout the majority of this fight, he should be able to pick apart Al-Qaisi from the outside, just because we've seen it before. We know kind of what we're going to get from Kelley. The footwork's such a big X factor that if I'm moving my feet, it's really hard for someone to try to plant and get a hold of me. And for Kelley, that footwork is going to be so essential in this fight. I think the speed's on his side. I do think a lot of the striking acumen is with Tony Kelley. Problem is, if Al-Qaisi does get his hands around you and is able to take you down to the ground, it's going to be a really interesting fight. And this is one of those fights where it's going to be really one-sided. I just don't really know which side it is going to go. Either Tony Kelley's going to be able to move on the outside, kind of piece apart Ali Al-Qaisi as the fight moves on, or if Al-Qaisi can get his hands together, get him up against the cage, really wear on Tony Kelley. Because with a guy like that who does really utilize his movement a lot, if you can use the leg kick, try to clinch him up, wear down on his gas tank, you're going to take a lot away from his game. So I do see this just being very definitive for either guy.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair assessment. It's kind of
It's a bit of a cop-out, but
yeah, it is really, but it should be an interesting fight. I mean, with Ali Al-Qaisi, we've seen it, like I said, even on the regional scene. He's got this awkward, kind of herky-jerky movement. He keeps his arms at weird angles. You don't really know what's going to come at you until he goes in. He shoots for the takedown. He might get you up against the cage. He's going to drag you down. And once he gets on top, it could be goodnight Irene. And for Tony Kelley, he's more of a Swiss Army knife, I would say, in the fact that there's a lot of different things that he could do. His jiu-jitsu is quite good. Again, his striking, it can be very unorthodox at times. And that's where the fight gets very interesting because Tony Kelley opened a plus 110 underdog. He's now a minus 218 favorite. That line dropped quick, and it's continued to teeter off for Tony Kelley. And for Ali Al-Qaisi, opened the favorite minus 130, boom, and then now he's a plus 175 underdog. But if you look over on Tapology, and this is one of those things that people can be critical about us because we pit Tapology versus the odds. These are the hardest of the hardcore fans. If you're watching our videos, chances are you probably vote yourself on Tapology and take it halfway serious. And if you don't, then you're a dingus. But if you look at the total votes at a 638, 62% going with Ali Al-Qaisi, 87% predicting him by decision. I find that interesting because it contradicts the odds in quite a bit of different circumstances. So people are putting their hard-earned dollars on Tony Kelley. People are just wildly making picks maybe with Ali Al-Qaisi. I don't think that's the circumstance. But Matt, I think you made a really good point. This fight could definitively go for either guy. Now, we saw Tony Kelley in his last fight take on a great wrestler in Kai Kamaka III. Made it an interesting fight. It was a close fight, but Kai Kamaka ultimately winning out in that one. So, Tony Kelley getting another chance, back down, going to 35 in this one. I worry, like I said, in the Omar Moraes fight against Giga Chikadze. Now, he's had time to cut the weight, but still, is it going to be an issue fighting at 135 pounds? I don't know. I mean, height-wise, reach-wise, all of those metrics point to a guy that, yeah, he should be able to make 35. I mean, body type-wise, I think he could make 35. But it's always one of those things that I scratch my head. So, ultimately, this pick, you're going to have to wait until question mark kicks on Saturday to get a really definitive look.
Oh, I'll give you mine right now. Tony Kelley.
I want to see what Kelley looks like on the scale. Because if he looks totally drawn out like a ghost of himself or shell of himself, then yeah, I mean, Ali Al-Qaisi all day. But the way that it goes right now, yes, I'm going to be in agreement. I think Tony Kelley is going to be able to get the win. I think ultimately the striking, the pop that's on the end of his shots, and then that jiu-jitsu. Cardio has been an issue or been a question mark at 45 for him. So maybe, again, that move to 35 could be an issue. But I think ultimately more tools in that toolbox for Tony Kelley. I think he's going to be able to get the win.
Yeah, I'm going to side with the betting man's favorite and the working man's underdog. Tony Kelley, that should be his new nickname maybe. Because, again, the footwork, the movement, I think it is going to cause Al-Qaisi a lot of problems throughout the fight. And I'm not as worried about weight cuts as Craig normally is. I know he's voiced that concern a few times. Yes, it is normally a concern, but with a guy like Tony Kelley, it's not like he's this massive 145er in the first place. And now you're asking yourself, like with Edson Barboza, when he moved down to 145, I'm like, how's he going to lose all that weight? But if Edson Barboza can drop 10 extra pounds and move down in a weight class, I'm sure Tony Kelley can too. So I'm not all that concerned about the weight cut. I do think he'll be able to get it done.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to this fight. We both have Tony Kelley to get the win. It's a great card. Ton of sleeper fights, so make sure you keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We got an extended look at our main event between Marlon Moraes and Cory Sandhagen. And as always, like we say with Fight Night Picks, Matt, let's get into it. Middleweight just keeps getting better and better, and this is a fight to really look forward to. We have Impa Kasanganay taking on Joaquin Buckley, new Mansa, and Impa Kasanganay coming in on a bit of short notice, replacing Abu Zaitsar, who's supposed to be the original opponent for Buckley now. Joaquin Buckley was a short notice opponent to Kevin Holland in his last fight. And Buckley had just won a fight. It was a former opponent. He had to get the win over him, and he did. Really impressive knockout win in LFA. So a week later, he steps in, takes on Kevin Holland. And some days you're the hammer, and some days you're the nail. And Joaquin Buckley was a pail of galvanized in that one.
Before we go any further, I just want to congratulate the UFC. It is nice to see them give these people who do come in on short notice. And yes, they might lose, and they might lose badly in some cases, but at least they will give them another opportunity to kind of show the best version of themselves. That's all I want to say.
But Joaquin Buckley in that fight, I mean, Kevin Holland shot for a takedown really early, got it, they scrambled, they struck, Kevin Holland outstruck him, got the win. And I mean, Joaquin Buckley, we've seen it, in previous fights. The guy is such a good striker. He's got shoulders like bowling balls, and he's a nice southpaw stance. He throws really hot and heavy. He can close distance quickly as well, and just a very athletic fighter. And for Impa Kasanganay, for a guy like that, he's more of a slow burn. He really brings it together. He doesn't start out maybe the strongest. He throws really nice power, and he's got a lot of whip on his shots. He can mix in a nice leg kick. And in the fight against Sugarfoot Adams on Contender Series, a lot of people were down on Kasanganay. They didn't like the performance, so he comes out against Maki Pitolo in a fight that, kind of 50-50, and he really impressed in that one. I thought that he looked great. So for Kasanganay, you're building off of the fact that, A, you're undefeated at 8-0, but so far, really nice 2-0 under a somewhat UFC banner, you could say, with Contender Series in the UFC. And for Joaquin Buckley, in his last 4 fights, 2-4, but the losses. Kevin Holland is a huge step above. And then down below, the loss in Bellator. Logan Storley, a lot of people don't talk about him because his fight style, it sucks.
Wrestling's gonna wrestle.
He's the most boring fighter that you're going to see. But it works, and he's a really good fighter. So Logan Storley, great wrestler, coming out of South Dakota, trains at Hard Knocks 365 with some of the best in the world. So that is what it is. The other thing that I remember we talked about with Impa Kasanganay, just briefly, was the fact that he trains at a Gym O. And if you're at all familiar with Gym O, let's go down through the list a little bit. Brian Barberena, you saw recently against Anthony Ivy, look amazing.
He's all right.
Okay, how about John Salter? I think that guy's a pretty good grappler. And we can go down through and continue to mention fighters that just fly way under the radar. Impa Kasanganay's there for now, but I think if he gets another big win, boom, he's really on the map. For Joaquin Buckley, if he can get a statement win over Impa Kasanganay, like he very well could, he really puts himself on the map, and that loss to Kevin Holland just becomes a blip on the radar. So this fight is very, very interesting. Height-wise, reach-wise, age-wise, they're the same. Mike Goldberg would even say they're virtually identical, except one's an orthodox, one's southpaw, and they don't totally fight the same. But it's a great fight. What do you think of this one?
So I like what you had said about Impa Kasanganay. It's a bit of a slow burn because you see people built like him, and you immediately think of like Apollo Costa, where they're either gonna just rush out there and kind of blow their load immediately, or they're gonna try to wait and just try to conserve themselves. And I do think Kasanganay has kind of figured out that my cardio might not be the best, but if I just fight with a slightly lower output, put more pop behind my shots, I'm going to be able to fight those hard 15-minute fights no matter what. And I think that's it shows that he's a really smart fighter, even though he doesn't have a massive amount of experience behind him. Because you look at 8-0, okay, he might make some rookie mistakes, but then when you actually watch his fights, I'm not going to stay and say that Maki Pitolo's this top tier middleweight, but I think beating Maki Pitolo is a really important fight for anyone in the UFC because he's a great measuring stick. And we say this, there's a lot of guys out there like this. I think Court McGee's another guy like that. I know he just lost, but still, they're guys who, yes, they might not ever be in the top 15, and they might not be in the top 15 in the near future, but they're guys that if you could beat them on any given night, it just kind of proves that you belong in that top. And yes, this is loose, but you belong in that top 30. You belong in the UFC, and you belong to keep on getting scheduled for fights. Now, as much as I just praised the UFC for giving Joaquin Buckley another fight, this is not the easiest fight to give him with a full camp. There's a lot of other guys at 185, a lot of exciting fights you could give him. Bavon Lewis is a guy who you could probably match Buckley up with. I just think it's a little bit too much too soon. I think Kasanganay, frame-wise and speed-wise, he isn't going to be able to do what Kevin Holland can. And on the ground, of course, Kevin Holland, he's just so unorthodox. So there's not a lot of guys who can replicate what he is able to do. But Kasanganay, the physically stronger out of the two, I'd say they're striking. It's similar. I'd actually give Buckley a slight speed advantage because if you do look back at that Kevin Holland fight, his hand speed's great. It's just Kevin Holland's footwork, and he has a good chin in the end too. Like, Buckley was able to crack him. I think this is a very fun fight. I think it's closer than the odds kind of show, but I am siding with Kasanganay because from what I've seen, or from what he's shown me at least, he's the more well-rounded out of the two, and no matter where the fight goes, I can kind of trust Impa Kasanganay.
And I mean, that's where it gets a little weird. You look at the Tapology predictions out of 611 votes, 89% have Kasanganay, 77% have him to win by decision. He opened a minus 245 favorite, now somewhat around a minus 260. So the odds have kind of gone back and forth just a little bit. And if you look at Joaquin Buckley, he opened a plus 185. He's now plus 205. So a little bit of change being thrown in the corner of Impa Kasanganay. I think it is a closer fight than those odds state. Again, you've seen the hand speed from Buckley, the fact that he's a southpaw. He was originally training for Abu Zaitsar. And if you've ever seen brother Otman Zaitsar, you know how good of a boxer he is. And Abu Zaitsar, very, very exciting fighter, really good hand speed as well. And that would have been a great fight. I think this one's a good one. I'm surprised Joaquin Buckley didn't open maybe a little bit closer.
I agree.
And this is one of those fights that, for a number of reasons, I would fade it. I mean, that's pretty much the only reason I have, really. But I think it's a good fight. I do just slightly favor Impa Kasanganay in this one. I think it's going to be, again, a slow burn type of a fight. I certainly, I take my chances with Impa Kasanganay. This should be such a fun fight. It's another one of those ones. You got the pop, you got the popcorn. You just sit back and watch because Joaquin Buckley could go right in there, throw an overhand left and just starch him. Or Impa Kasanganay could hang behind the jab. He could move in and out. Maybe not the quickest movements, but still. And really just win over on points. He's got the power as well. So I like that as far as a decision win. Going to agree slightly with those darn Tapology voters, but that's the way that I do see this fight ultimately going, and I'm siding with Kasanganay.
It's hard to disagree with that. I do think that Joaquin Buckley has the hand speed and the power that, yes, he could clip Impa Kasanganay at any point during the fight, but the consistency of Kasanganay and the fact that I know he's going to be there in the third round like he will be in the first round, it's really hard to pick against him in this fight. But if Joaquin Buckley does go out there and completely starch Impa Kasanganay, not that it'll completely get rid of the Kevin Holland fight, but you can largely discredit that fight too. Oh, it was on short notice. Kevin Holland, he's kind of up in the rankings anyways. But I do think Impa Kasanganay.
Just like when Kevin Holland fought Thiago
Santos.
Santos.
Works
Remember
both ways.
that? All right, Matt. I'm really looking forward to this card. We both have Impa Kasanganay to get the win. I'm really looking forward to a lot of the sleeper fights. Not just, your main event that you have to keep tuned in for. You've got Marlon Moraes taking on Cory Sandhagen. Matt, so exciting.
Oh, yeah.
Really looking forward to it. And Matt, as we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Kyle's brothers fighting. We've got Chris Daukaus taking on Zé Colmeia, Rodrigo Nascimento. It's Rodrigo Nascimento. We made a mistake with the pronunciation. Please excuse us and enjoy the rest of the video. Matt, I say that because Kyle Daukaus, in his UFC debut at 185 pounds against Brendan Allen, really impressed a lot of people. So what did the UFC decide to do? Let's just snatch another Daukaus out of CFFC ahead of a fight that, Chris Daukaus, he was supposed to be taking on Sean Teed, which was an early career loss. They were going to fight for the CFFC Heavyweight Championship. There was not so much bad blood on the line, but you had Philadelphia's own just trying to defend his honor and go back out there and get a staple win. They pluck him out of that fight and put him into a really interesting contest against Parker Porter, who the guy weighed in at 265, and the day of the fight told John Anik, maybe in confidence, maybe not, that he weighed 282 friggin' pounds the next day for the fight. And Parker Porter looked like we thought Parker Porter would. He was a big guy, threw a lot of power. Chris Daukaus really outstruck him. And Chris Daukaus put on an interesting performance. And really, if you look back at Daukaus's, regional career, the loss that he had to Zhu Enyanwu that we would end up seeing in the UFC and in Bellator, in losing efforts, he put it on him. And he got finished, but he really did put on a good performance. So we had a good idea of what Chris Daukaus was going to bring into the octagon. And not to say that it was easy to predict a win against Parker Porter because it's heavyweight MMA. Who knows? We like to think we do, but we're not clairvoyants. You know that at home. You do. But ultimately, Chris Daukaus came out, put on the pressure, got a really big win against Parker Porter. But across the cage from Matt, I mean, Rodrigo Nascimento has looked amazing. And I'm going to let you take it over from there because this guy's a submission machine. Also trains an American Top Team with Marcus Rogerio de Lima and, oh, by the way, Junior Dos Santos. I think Junior Dos Santos pretty good guy to use to get ready for Chris Daukaus, who he could put them hands on you, he could put them tangs on him and knock him down, like Shannon Sharp would say. But ultimately, I mean, this fight's tailor-made for Rodrigo Nascimento.
Yeah, giving away your prediction a little early, but I do agree. And Nascimento, you had mentioned some of his training partners. I'll throw another one out there. Antonio Carlos Jr., another Brazilian who fights down at ATT. Because that grappling is really going to be...
Who won top at heavyweight.
It's another just great training partner for him to have. And Chris Daukaus, the Parker Porter fight was an interesting one. Because you had a guy who was pretty much as big as a heavyweight can get versus Chris Daukaus, who, if there was a cruiserweight weight class, I'm sure that's where Daukaus would probably be fighting, because you can tell that frame-wise, he is more similar to kind of a 205er, but you can just tell there's a lot more added weight on there, because I'm assuming that's probably what he walks around at. And you got to think, though, too, the difference between a fighter who can fight at 205 compared to one who can cut down to make 265 is massive. So maybe Daukaus just doesn't want to put his body through that to make 205, but his fighting style, he has a bit of that middleweight style into his game, kind of like his brother, because when you look at Chris Daukaus, very mobile for a heavyweight, likes to use his footwork, will use his boxing, but we've seen it before. He's a really good technician on the feet, but he's way too open to a brawl. If he does get clipped, he just kind of, not that he sees red, but he sees red, and he'll just kind of go forward and throw caution to the wind. And against a guy like Nascimento, if he is able to clip you, and if you do kind of have that, okay, I'm going to go get it back right now mindset, he's going to drop down, double leg you, and take you down to the ground, and then you're automatically in his world. Because on the feet, I would argue Nascimento he might not be as fast as Daukaus, but he certainly has the power. He's got underrated combinations too, and kicks. And then the second the fight goes to the ground for any period of time, I would argue that the best position for either guy would be Nascimento on top of the ground of Daukaus. The fact that all of the grappling kind of goes to Nascimento and the striking sort of 50-50, it gives away my prediction right now, but I don't know how Rodrigo Nascimento loses this fight.
This is another thing, and listen, I mean, it's heavyweight. I prefaced it by saying that. Chris Daukaus could walk in there, throw one punch, and knock him out. He could go in there and Hamzat Shemaev, Gerald Meerschaert. I don't see it happening.
Like a head kick.
It could happen, but you look at this fight, and I mean, for Rodrigo Nascimento, I think he's probably one of the guys that's not talked about enough that can creep right into the top 15. You wake up one morning and go, hey, who's that guy? Never heard of him before. Just like Augusto Sakai was able to do, and then all of a sudden you're fighting Alistair over him. It's like, hey, where'd this guy come from? So for Rodrigo Nascimento, he has the jiu-jitsu in his back pocket, and the fact that he's had so many nice submission wins, and I mean, he came into the UFC, you're looking at it. I mean, we go back 5 fights. So we look at the fight against Fabricio Nascimento. He beats a guy making his debut 4 years, 5 months ago. Takes a layoff. Then he beats Fabio Cyborg, who was 1-4. Everton Dos Anjos, Rafael? No relation. But 4-1. Then he beat Markel Martinic on Contender Series a year ago in a fight where Martinic looked good going into that fight. A lot of people high on Martinic. And Nascimento goes in there. The submission was great. I mean, the arm triangle choke, he had him right down, locked it in tight. And then the fight against Don'Tale Mayes, this is where it gets a little froggy fresh because Rodrigo Nascimento beats Don'Tale Mayes. And I remember previewing that fight with Matt, and I'm not going to throw the throwback into that one. Matt said Mayes because Mayes good on the feet. Mayes bodied up, really, at 265. You're not going to find a fighter that has such a nice physique, I guess. And Chris Daukaus, we throw this term around loosely, and I don't mean it any disrespect, but bag of milk. Bag of milk. We have bagged milk in Canada. It's weird, I know. But Rodrigo Nascimento, a guy that's moved his life from Brazil up to ATT, living in Florida, training with those guys, dedicating your life to this. You're undefeated to this point. Do I think Chris Daukaus has a chance? For sure. Let's see how the voters think of this one on Tapology. At 651 votes, 88% going Nascimento, 74% saying he's going to win by submission. The odds, I was actually kind of surprised that Nascimento was such a favorite. He opened a -310. That line's crept up a bit. He's a -283 average on best fight odds. If you look at it for Chris Daukaus, open +260. The line dropped to 1 point. You had Daukaus like at a +215. He's now +225. So Nascimento, Heavily favored by the voters, heavily favored by odds makers, heavily favored by Craig. How do you see it?
Also heavily favored by Matt, oddly enough. When you see that the striking kind of similar, again, I do think the hand speed of Christakis is underrated. I just think his movement as a heavyweight is quite underrated too. And the good thing about both these guys going forward, doesn't really matter who wins, who loses, because at 27 and at 31, those are two of the younger heavyweights you're going to find around. It's kind of crazy to think, because like at lightweight 27, you're in the prime of your career. But at heavyweight, you're basically a rookie at that point, because you have so much time to kind of gain that experience, to gain those different attributes and whatnot. You gotta look at a guy like Alistair Overeem's had, 80 MMA fights, or 80 just, combat sports fights, and he's 47 years old, and he's still doing it at a really high level. So it's not the end of the world if either one of these guys does get a loss. I'm not gonna liken this to a Tanner Boser-Cyril Gane matchup, where you kind of knew that, okay, the winner of this might be the best prospect, but the future's super bright for both guys. I kind of liken that fight to this, just because I do think both guys are gonna be in the UFC for a while after this, but I just see Nascimento kind of run away with it on the ground.
Yeah, I've got Brazil's Rodrigo Nascimento as well, Matt. We're really looking forward to this fight and this card in general, because this isn't like your co-main event from last weekend where it's, unranked heavyweights in the co-main and yikes. This one should ultimately deliver. Cross your fingers, cross your toes, hide your kids, hide your wife. Matt, I'm looking forward to this. The entire card, an extended look at our main event between Marlon Moraes and Cory Sandhagen. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. Really interesting UFC debut from Canada's own KB Bhullar, the Bengal. It's a great nickname. This is a guy that's coming out of Unified MMA, former middleweight champ. Recently picked up a big win over Matt Dwyer in his last time out. You might be familiar with the name Matt Dwyer. He had a couple of fights in UFC, actually more than a couple. Had a win there, had a few losses, but fought some good competition there as well. I mean, the last two, Alan Jouban and Rude Boy Randy Brown, just to name a few. And since then, he had been racking up some wins. Bhullar going in there 7-0, picked up a really big decision win. We'll talk about that fight a little bit more. It is hard, and I'm sure there's going to be comments out there, hey, where can I find fight tape of KB Bhullar? You can find it. It's there. You got to check out the seedy parts of the internet. I'm talking the Facebooks and Fight TV. You might have to drop some coin. We had to drop $6.88 Canadian to watch that Matt Dwyer fight, but it was worth it, and we picked up some valuable intel, because you can find clips out there of KB Bhullar taking on Cody Cran in the fight before that. And what we know about KB Bhullar coming out of Hayabusa Training Center in Edmonton, Alberta. And listen, Alberta, we've seen some UFC fighters out of there. I mean, Bonneville's own Tanner Boser lighting up heavyweight right now. And I know last weekend, John Anik made a point, and rightfully so, Matt, you made the same point. Charles Jourdain, is he our only hope as Canadians to have a big-time talent at, just maybe 45 or just in MMA in general? I think we might have forgot about Tanner Boser for just a second there, but there are a few, top talents popping up. KB Bhullar's one of those guys right now, undefeated. He can have a fan-friendly style. I mean, he started out his mixed martial arts career in Taekwondo. He's rounded it out over the last bit of time and took on UFC caliber competition in Matt Dwyer's last time out, picked up a decision win. Opposite him, Tom Breese is getting ready for a fight against Russia's Roman Kopylov. And what can I say about Tom Breese? I mean, he fought a decent level of competition at 70, moved up to 85. He had lost a split decision to Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland's a wild striker. He can do a lot of special things on the feet, and he's moving up to 85. That's interesting. But for Tom Breese, picked up a huge win over Judo Dan Kelley, a guy who loved knee wraps, and it was a huge win for him there. He had a long layoff between that fight and the fight against Brendan Allen, and I know there were varying reasons as to why. I know he had battled anxiety, and it was just tough for him to make the walk to the cage. He'd been booked in a lot of different fights. He drew Brendan Allen. We had picked Allen in that fight, and you've seen it recently, just how good Brendan Allen's been from going from LFA to maybe not looking so stellar in some of his fights to now really bringing everything together. The fight against Kyle Dawkins was great. The fight against Tom Breese was a huge statement win, because Tom Breese, what we know about him, this guy, when he shows up, his striking's on point. He's one of the most electrifying guys. I say that because I get pumped up for some of these fights, but you can't sleep on a Tom Breese fight, man.
You really can't, and that Dan Kelley fight was a really important one, because a lot of people forget there was a time when Dan Kelley was actually a favorite over Derek Brunson in an MMA fight. I'm just going to take a second, let that sink in, that Judo Dan Kelley was the favorite over Derek Brunson. Now, of course, Derek Brunson knocked him out in about 50 seconds, but Dan Kelley, another one of those great measuring stick guys, but I would even have him kind of a step above. Like, if you beat Dan Kelley, maybe it's not a top 15 guy, but if you beat Dan Kelley, I'll say it's the Jim Miller effect, where you beat him, it's not an easy fight from there on out. It's a guy who's well known enough, and people know of his skill, that if you beat him, you're going to fight a guy who at least at one point was in the top 15. And you're probably not going to get a number next to your name shortly after, but it's a very good statement win. And Tom Breese looked huge in that fight. It was one of those situations where, you know when you see Thiago Santos like 205, and you're like, oh my god, how did that man weigh 185 pounds for any period of his life? Tom Breese kind of had that, because he was bigger than Dan Kelley, and he was like much more physical than him. And Tom Breese does have kind of one of those more, his style relies on his athleticism a lot. And the fighter who always comes to mind when I say this is Alexander Rakic, because Rakic is one of those unique MMA talents where athleticism doesn't always come into play in MMA. You look at a guy like, here's a good example, Paulo Costa, Israel Adesanya. You look at Paulo Costa, you're like, well, he's by far the more athletic out of the two. But then when you use, MMA skills and whatnot, they can kind of equal that barrier. With Tom Breese, he uses physicality along with his really good boxing skills, goes to the body, which is something that you, first of all, if you're an MMA fighter who goes to the body with your punches, automatically you already at a much higher striking level than other people in MMA, because that's really where I separate the high level MMA strikers from like the regular MMA strikers. If you're one of those guys who can go leg, body, and head and go do them all consistently, I immediately put you in kind of a separate category for striking. Not that Tom Breese is some Israel Adesanya as striker,
But he could become the next Stipe Miocic or Alexander Volkanovski or Max Holloway with that style, right?
no.
Okay.
And the elbows are really good from Tom Breese, and that was kind of his downfall in the Brendan Allen fight, and that's kind of what I'm tying this back into. His clinch work is phenomenal. If Tom Breese can get close, he's got those good elbows. Reminds me a little bit of Anthony Smith in that regard, where if he gets you up against the cage, he can just kind of unload on you. And if he does get that single collar tie or the tie clinch, he can really, beat you up pretty bad in there. KB Bhullar, though, just from the limited sample size we've been able to see from his fights, the Dwyer fight was interesting because I think we'll both agree Dwyer in that second round already looked really, really tired and kind of brought it back.
We got to throw this out there. I mean, you always talk about it early on in a fight. The Sandhagen Sterling fight is a perfect one because the guys are still dry. Sterling's just able to get down, get on the back, and sink that choke in so quick and get that finish. Whereas you look at that fight between Dwyer and Bhullar, and they were sweating by the end of the first hardcore, and Dwyer walked out there in the second and looked like a zombie. Now, he was able to ride on like a tricycle or like a beach cruiser, so to speak, because we weren't in second or third gear. We just stayed in a first gear, if that. And the output went down from Dwyer. He kind of went to wrestling and went to clinch work. And we saw Bhullar in the later rounds. It was like, all right, well, Matt Dwyer's taking him down. And KB Bhullar's not as flashy of a striker as we've seen. And that's the other thing. With KB Bhullar, he's a southpaw from convention, I guess. He'll switch it over to orthodox. And Matt, you and I talked about this before we filmed the video. The fact that there's a lot of people you'll see, if they're a southpaw fighter, they'll switch into orthodox quick. They'll do something, an explosive movement, a nice low kick. They'll attack the knee. They'll hit the body. They'll throw, maybe they've got a Superman punch, something wild. We see this from KB Bhullar. He'll go from southpaw to orthodox. He just doesn't really string a whole lot together. And we saw that in the fight before the Dwyer fight. We saw that in the fight against Cody Cran where he'd do it. It didn't really set a whole lot up. Now, he's got flying knees. He's got really explosive movements. We saw it in the fight against Dwyer where he threw a wild, not fight name picks question mark kicks, but he threw a question mark kick off his lead leg that dropped Dwyer. Cool, yeah. But Dwyer was so tired in that fight. So it was a little bit of a combination of both. But KB Bhullar, he's a flashy striker. He's got really nice things that he can bring out. And that last fight, a 5-round fight. But man, it wasn't the best 5-round fight.
No, and I just think it's a lot to ask for a guy like Tom Breese. Yes, he's had his issues as of late, but if you lose to Sean Strickland many years ago at this point, and then in your last fight you lose to Brendan Allen, who has a win over Ian Heinisch, and was supposed to fight Ian Heinisch again until Heinisch unfortunately got hurt, but I think really highly of Brendan Allen, so losing to him, even if it was in the first round, I don't think that takes too much shine off of you. And I was still pretty high on Tom Breese. I think if he can kind of get it together for this fight, if he comes in there with a good state of mind and just goes out there and performs to the best of his abilities, I don't see how Tom Breese loses this fight.
And I mean, Matt, with the wrestling pedigree of Tom Breese, and I say pedigree, but he has it in his back pocket for sure. And I know it was mentioned, if you want to go back and find something really interesting, because this happens sometimes with Fight Night Picks, we had Tom Breese's coach pop into the chat and say that, we were high on Brendan Allen as far as his grappling was concerned. He offered quite a bit of a paragraph in favor of Tom Breese's grappling, the improvements that he had made, and it was something that we needed to watch out for. And maybe it didn't happen in that fight, but you can see, as advertised on Tom Breese's Tapology page, that it is something he's worked on. I mean, Grapplefest 6 against former Cage Warriors champ Lee Chadwick, Andy Clamp at Grapplefest 7, and then Freddie Vosgroni at Polaris UK. And hey, Polaris events are fun too. So Tom Breese has all of that and a bag of chips. KB Bhullar coming in here, head of steam, the Canadian. Over on Tapology, though, at a 586 total votes, 78% going Breese, 58% saying he's going to win by decision. The odds are overwhelmingly in the English fighter's favor. Tom Breese opened a -215. The line popped up just ever so slightly for Bhullar, and it's dropped down since. Tom Breese -262 favorite. KB Bhullar coming in here, the +210 underdog after opening, +165. So everybody's in the favor of Breese. Hopefully we gave, a little bit of perspective on both these guys, because you got to run it kind of down the middle. I mean, KB Bhullar, he can be a flashy striker. He can switch his stances. He could very well catch Tom Breese with something totally unorthodox that he's never going to see and send him 6 ways to Sunday. I just don't see that happening in this one. And I'm going to have to side with the guy that I can't say he's been consistent, but I can't say he's been totally inconsistent, and that's troubling. But I do like Tom Breese more in this fight.
Oh, yeah, Tom Breese, higher level of competition. Again, he hasn't been active as of late, but I know what I'm going to get when the best Tom Breese goes out there. And again, I don't really know what the best Tom Breese is at this point, but from what I've seen of him throughout his UFC career, him at his best, really good power, really good movement, really good cardio, and that's going to be hard to beat for anyone in the UFC debut, so I'm also picking Tom Breese.
Matt, both of us going Tom Breese. Unfortunately, we can't side with the Canadian. It seems like lately we can never side with the Canadians unless you're Charles Jourdain. You end up with a weird draw. Really looking forward to this card coming at us this weekend. We're going to extend a look at our main event between Marlon Moraes and Cory Sandhagen. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, and as we always say, let's get into it. Featherweight is absolutely on fire. We have a really interesting fight coming at us this weekend between the Moroccan devil, Youssef Zalal, somebody that MMA fans have come to know and love. And he's only had 3 fights in the UFC, but they've all been really impressive wins. And he's taking on maybe a relative unknown to a lot of MMA fans. You have Georgian transplanted to Spain. That's where he's going to be training out of, Ilia Topuria. And we've seen him with Cage Warriors winning their bantamweight title over Brian Boulon in a fight where the guy just shot right in for a takedown, got it. I mean, it was pretty much all Topuria until he put down Brian Boulon and just put him to sleep in that fight. Looked amazing there. Went from Cage Warriors where, like I said, he weighed 139 pounds for a 135-pound title fight. That's not great, but with Brave, he took on a guy in his debut, got a big win there, and in his last time out against Steven Goncalves, I mean, it was a fight where Goncalves landed a head kick, and then followed him up with a punch, knocked him down. Topuria, we saw him where he has that background in Greco-Roman wrestling and a black belt in jiu-jitsu, able to really capitalize on the ground. I mean, he had him in all sorts of nasty choke positions, his opponent able to get out of them. And then once they got back onto the feet, a dynamite right hand and knocked him out. And it was Goncalves' first time being finished in his career. To that point, he was 6-2. So really, really explosive fighter is Ilia Topuria. I wonder how the gas tank's going to go for him. I mean, so far in his MMA career, I mean, it's been a lot of finishes. It's been a lot of early fights. And we haven't seen him go the distance. He's got the 1 knockout win, 7 wins by submission. And for Youssef Zalal, Matt, I mean, you talk about hype trains in MMA. You've got the Chimaev hype train. You've got some other hype trains. And Youssef Zalal is in the some other hype train category because I don't think a lot of people are sleeping on him. I mean, big win over Austin Lingo in his debut where, the odds were pretty close. A lot of people high on Lingo. Then he comes out and fights Jordan Griffin in a fight that was close. I mean, he won a unanimous 29-28 decision. He did look good. He got taken down a couple times. And then his last time out, total mismatch when he fought Peter Barrett and he blew him out of the water. So Youssef Zalal, we've seen him good fight against Lingo, closer fight against Griffin, really good performance in his last time out against Peter Barrett, taking on the unknown commodity in 23-year-old Ilia Topuria, 24-year-old Zalal. I like this fight because it's somewhat of a clash of styles. You look at Youssef Zalal when he fights, he can fight almost in an ambidextrous type of motion. He can fight good on the right side, good on the left side. That's an oversimplification, but you know what I'm talking about. The kid can throw kicks to the leg, kicks to the body, kicks to the head. He can throw wild techniques. His wrestling defense has been quite good. We haven't really seen it tested, I should say, except in the Griffin fight. where he's taking on Ilia Topuria, where he got a knockout in his last fight, but who would have ever thought that was going to happen? You would have much sooner sided with a submission prop than one by knockout. But he looked amazing in that one. I'm excited about this fight, Matt. I got to can that excitement. It's your turn. Here we go. What do you think?
So I'm as excited for this fight as I am for any other, except for the main event, just because I think that's such good matchmaking. Zalal versus Topuria is going to be interesting because, like you had said, it's a clash of styles, but both guys kind of do everything. Because we saw from Topuria, his striking has continued to evolve. You can tell he's one of those guys who came into MMA very much a grappler, but as he's been in the MMA world, very much improved his striking throughout. Youssef Zalal, very interesting case because there's nothing he can't do, but there's nothing he's so overwhelmingly good at that I think he's just going to blow Topuria out of the water. For as long as this fight's on the feet, I'm going to side with Zalal. I think he has the cleaner striking. I think he's got the better defensive movement as well on the feet, but it's not like Topuria is this Damian Maia type character where he's only out there to grapple. He has good striking. He has good kicks too. Not afraid to mix it up. Zalal's wrestling, I think, is going to be a bit of a problem for Topuria, and that's the one area of this fight where I would kind of give Zalal the edge. Not that Topuria is a bad wrestler by any means, but we've seen that Zalal, not only does he have good hips for defending takedowns, if you are able to take him down, his scrambles are phenomenal, and say what you will about Jordan Griffin and his run in the UFC, but we know what his grappling is like, and the fact that a lot of that fight was Griffin going for the takedowns, Zalal just kind of defending it and really making him pay for it on the entries and the exits. And I think that's going to be a really important thing to watch throughout this fight because especially in the first round, if Topuria is going for the takedowns and he is able to get some, he might not be able to get others, but if he's not really wearing out his gas tank a crazy amount, and if he isn't eating a lot of damage, he can kind of do that for all 3 rounds. Just rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Zalal's got to stay on his bike, can't let himself get backed up against the cage. We saw that in the Yorgan Castro fight this past weekend where he just kept on rushing forward and holding Buddy against the cage. And I don't think we're going to see that in this fight. I must say this is going to be a much more exciting fight than last weekend's co-main event. But it's just something that he's going to have to do because I do think Topuria is going to be going to chain wrestle a lot in this fight to try to... Not that he doesn't respect the ground game or the jiu-jitsu of Youssef Zalal. I just think Ilia Topuria knows where his strengths lie. And for him to win this fight, he is going to really have to mix it up and make this an MMA fight. Because if this is just a fight on the outside, not that Topuria's striking is not good, but Zalal has quite a bit of pop behind his shots. I think the calf kicks are going to be a problem for Topuria as well. If Youssef Zalal is able to really start attacking that front leg, really both legs too, because Topuria can switch stances. If he can really invest in those leg kicks early on, I think you're going to take away some of the explosiveness of Topuria, and a lot of that will take away from his takedown and his wrestling game. So if Zalal can just fight a really smart fight, I think he should be able to have the game plan to win it.
And I mean, this is such an interesting fight because it really is a clash of styles, and you like to see those. Out of the Tapology votes, 590 of them, 84% going Zalal, 77% predicting a win by decision. This is where it gets interesting. We look at the odds, and Youssef Zalal opened a big favorite, and here's why. It's because he was originally supposed to face Sungwoo Choi. Choi's out. In steps Ilia Topuria. And we talked about it earlier on in this card. We've had some short notice replacements, some different fights falling in and out. The Tom Breese fight, he's supposed to be taking on Roman Kopylov. Then you have Canada's KB Bhullar popping in. And we've seen it more and more on these cards where it's short notice fights or short notice replacements. So in this one, you go from Sungwoo Choi, really exciting style. Maybe he hasn't brought it together totally in the UFC, but that would have been a very different fight than this fight with Topuria, and I think that lends credence to a possible Topuria win. So Youssef Zalal opens a minus 270 favorite. He's now a minus 186. If you look over across the cage at Ilia Topuria, open a plus 190. He's now at a plus 155 or thereabouts. I really do like the upside out of both of these guys. I think they have a lot of time to, grow in the division. 45's not going anywhere. This isn't 2004, so it's not like we're going to go to the dark ages and we're going to lose the lower weight classes. This is the most exciting weight class of them. And I mean, you could say that for a lot of them, but I think this is definitely one of them. And
as Craig speaks in riddles.
You have a great champion in Alexander Volkanovski. Again, upsides high on both guys. I really do like the underdog in his UFC debut here in Ilia Topuria. I like the top position. I like the submission threats. I like him, even if he was to somehow land on bottom, I think he has a good opportunity there as well. And he's one of those guys, and we don't see it very often, but when we do, we really get excited when you see a guy that his submission threats and his wrestling, it's so good that he can kind of just wing it on the feet. Now, I would worry about that, especially with a guy like Youssef Zalal. He can definitely make you pay. He's so dangerous from, again, either side. But I really do like Ilia Topuria in this one. I think if he's able to get in close and really bring it down to the mat quickly, this is a fight that we're going to talk about maybe in every single fight. But similar to the Aljamain Sterling fight with Cory Sandhagen, then I think Ilia Topuria in this one has a really good opportunity. And for that reason, this is one of the more coin flip type of fights on here. I like the underdog make his UFC debut on short notice. I think it's tough to get ready for a guy like Topuria to begin with. You got to spend months getting your wrestling and your jiu-jitsu ready. Now, Youssef Zalal is coming from a great camp to do so, Matt, I'll let you mention that. But Ilia Topuria has more than a good shot at getting a win here.
So it's not often Craig makes my case as he's trying to defend another fighter, but I think what you said about the fact that Ilia Topuria, he is going to have to open up his striking to get the takedowns. I don't think he can go out there and just double leg Youssef Zalal.
We've seen him do that before.
We have, but we've never seen him do that against a guy the caliber of Zalal. I know Zalal's beaten fighters of Ilia Topuria's caliber. Yep. I've never seen Topuria beat anyone on Zalal's caliber. And say what you will about some of Zalal's wins, but what he's shown in them is he's a very well-rounded mixed martial artist. There's not a lot of weaknesses to his game. And I do think that every time Topuria goes for a takedown, it's going to drain his gas tank a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And as the fight goes on, Zalal is the heavier-handed of these two. He's got the better cardio out of the two.
Coming out of Factory X, I mean, you saw Alexander Hernandez cornering different guys last weekend and even the weekend before that. And, I mean, the list goes on and on about the good fighters coming out of there.
Exactly. And really a roster known for their well-roundedness. I think Zalal has a great group of guys to work with. I think this is a pretty good matchup for him, and I do think he's going to be able to get the win. I don't think he's going to blow the doors off Topuria by any means, and I do think Topuria is going to be around for a while, but you're dealing with a really big guy at 145 versus one of the smaller featherweights out there, and something that's going to come down to the wrestling. So I'm going to pick the bigger and the stronger Youssef Zalal.
Matt, I remember back at Cage Warriors 94, just seeing the fight between Topuria and Breon Boulan, and that's a stack card. Go back and watch that one if you want to, but I was really excited about this guy, especially the way that he got that win. 2 more wins outside of the organization, and boom, you're in the UFC. So it should be a great fight. We'll disagree on the pick, but it should be a great fight, Matt. You're going with Youssef Zalal. I'm going to go with Ilia Topuria, and really looking forward to this card. We've got a great main event between 2 really tough outs. Cory Sandhagen taking on Marlon and Moraes. You're going to want to keep locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it. Listen, last weekend we had unranked heavyweights in our co-main event, and it was one of the worst fights I've ever seen. Now, it wasn't as bad as highly ranked heavyweights, you know, like that time that Francis Ngannou fought Derek Lewis. We'll forget all about that. But Carlos Felipe taking on Jorgen Castro was terrible. And I know a lot of people are high on Carlos Felipe, and that's your prerogative, but it was an awful fight, and as soon as he faced a wrestler, he's going to have a hard time. Now, in this fight, we have a UFC debutant against a guy that we've seen look amazing in his UFC debut. And this is a classic fight where you could throw stones across the English Channel because you have England versus France. You have a UFC debut out of the Black Samurai, Alain Baudot. And it's such an interesting fight because Tom Aspinall representing Team Calbon, and we saw it in his last time out on a card that was stacked with fighters from that gym. You had Darren Till taking on Robert Whittaker. You had Mike Grundy taking on Movsar Evloev. And you had Tom Aspinall taking on the biggest head scratcher of a guy in Jake Collier, who went from 85 to 205 to years off to 265. Tom Aspinall, what are you doing there? Well, you knew from his pedigree the fact that he trained highly in jiu-jitsu. He coaches in jiu-jitsu at the gym. And oh, by the way, took a few years off just for fun, decided to become a professional boxer. And who does he train with? I'm giving you a second, audience at home. You might tune out, but Tyson Fury. He trains with Tyson Fury. Not like I go to a gym that's got like Tyson Fury's name on the nameplate. This guy trains with the Tyson Fury. So we've seen that crispness in his boxing just improve fight over fight. And yeah, he hadn't fought the greatest level of competition on the regional scene coming into the UFC. And yeah, maybe Jake Collier wasn't the best litmus test. The kid came in there throwing cinder blocks. His technique looked amazing. His footwork was great. And just for a guy to have that good of boxing with that foundation in jiu-jitsu, Tom Aspinall could soon become a guy that you have to watch out for in the heavyweight division. We see it with Rodrigo Nascimento in this card. And yeah, he might win, he might lose. I don't know. I'm not a clairvoyant. But we've seen it where that guy's jiu-jitsu is so good. He trains with such good strikers. Maybe he could pull things together. He's undefeated and go on a run. Tom Aspinall is one of those guys that had that foundation in jiu-jitsu, brought his hands together, and boom, here he is. Now he's taking on Alain Baudot, and this is a guy that, I mean, he trains out of another great gym in the world, MMA Factory. Main training partners include Francis Ngannou, Cyril Gane, and you've seen Ferdinand Lopes just do big things in MMA. That's a gym that you definitely have to watch out for. Now, for Monsieur Alain, He's coming up from 205 pounds. He had a fight against not Sam Stout, but Todd Stout, guy that trains in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, for the TKO Light Heavyweight Championship. And listen, Matt, we've gone back. We watched that terrible highlight reel if you're not Dalcha champ with EFC. But if you're Alain Baudot, I mean, man, the guy got knocked out so hot and heavy against Dalcha Lujanbula. It didn't go his way. In the Todd Stout fight, he lost it. I mean, he threw caution to the wind in his striking. And then when it, and I hate to use cliche, but when the rubber hit the road, the guy got taken down. Stout took his back, submitted him. And then, my God, it seems like every week we have to talk about a fighter whose fight's overturned to either a no contest or a loss. But Todd Stout, that fight is now a loss on his record. And for Alain Baudot, it's considered a win, even though he lost it. So for Alain Baudot, I just worry about the wildness of his striking. Yeah, will it win him some fights? I mean, it's won him 8 this far, 7. But in a fight against Tom Aspinall, man, I worry.
Yeah, speed kills, and I really can't stress this enough.
It was a driving campaign, not a drug campaign.
Exactly, but I can't stress this enough that in MMA, speed is way more important than power, because with speed, it matters a lot more how many times you can hit your opponent than how hard you can hit your opponent, because we've seen it more times than not. Volume strikers tend to beat power strikers, and I do think Tom Aspinall's in this really interesting position in the heavyweight division right now, because other than the champ Stipe Miocic, and I'm going to say that Tom Aspinall's boxing is on this level, I'd argue he has some of the better pure striking in the division. Now, of course, you have to add in the other MMA skills to that, but Tom Aspinall's a guy who can go out there, has good footwork, has really good footwork, has good cardio, and he's another guy, we had mentioned this in the Chris Dawkins video, where Chris Dawkins, if he really wanted to, he is more of a cruiserweight. Tom Aspinall's kind of that same body type too. Not the biggest heavyweight you're going to see.
6'5", though.
He is 6'5", but again, when you see his frame, he's built kind of like Jean Vellante. He's not one of these guys who looks like...
Time out. Not 2020 Jean Vellante.
Not 2020 Jean Vellante. But he is one of these guys you can tell he doesn't have to cut to make weight. He walks around at about 240, 245, so it's not like it's this massive weight cut for him, and he fights quite comfortably in the division. But back to the speed. The hand speed of Tom Aspinall is going to give a lot of guys problems in this division. No, he's not the most powerful guy. He doesn't have this crazy loop to his shots, and that's the thing that makes him dangerous, because in heavyweight, a lot of guys rely on the fact that they can knock you out with one punch. Tom Aspinall, that's not really his game plan going into the fight. He realizes that if he does just stick to his boxing skills, the worst case scenario is you're going to try to take him down. And as Craig kind of mentioned, it's not really a bad thing for him. Tom Aspinall's pretty good on the ground. Black belt in jiu-jitsu, teaches jiu-jitsu at his gym. And I know I'm making Tom Aspinall sound like some world beater right now, but when you look at the prospects at heavyweight, I'm not going to say he's going to beat like a Cyril Gane tomorrow. But I do think Tom Aspinall's a guy who can go out there, rattle off 3-4 wins in a row, and we will see him in the top 15 sooner rather than later.
And I mean, I hate to rag on him, because I really do hope for the best out of Alain Baudot. But if you look at his record, I mean, so the fight against Todd Stout, it's a DQ. It's a fight that he lost, but it was overturned after the fact. It was a year and 5 months ago. So his last real win was over Yuto Nakajima back 2 years, 4 months ago. And at the time, Nakajima was 0-2. So then you look at the loss against Dalcha Lujanbula. That fight was 3 years, 2 months ago. Then before that, he had a win over Yusuke Masuda, who was 6-11-3. That's 3 years, 7 months ago. Listen, sometimes guys break out of that in a big way. They come out and you think, man, this guy's fought cans all the way up. What's going to happen? And then he starts beating actually good fighters. And you go, wow, this guy's awesome. But from Alain Baudot, I just haven't seen it on the regional scene. I've seen wild striking. I've seen looping punches. And it's not to the point where we critique high-level fighters. And again, what the hell do I know? But we'll critique really high-level fighters and say, well, geez, fighter A has really nice punches right down the middle, has a nice whip at the end of his or her shots, they have power, versus somebody that throws a lot of hooks, a lot of looping shots, and we can get really critical when it gets to the nitty-gritty. But this is one of those fights where we've seen Tom Aspinall perform at this high level with his technique, with his power, what he can do. Maybe he gets clipped. You always have to worry about that at heavyweight. For Alain Baudot, I'd like to see where he weighs in at heavyweight for this one, because like you said, Tom Aspinall, I've got the recent weigh-in in his last fight against Jake Collier coming in at 248. I'm not a fan of the Jean Vellante comparisons, because, man, that guy's body at 265.
No,
yikes.
and of course he's way better than Jean Vellante.
I hear where you're coming from. So for Baudot, there's way too many question marks. If we look at it over on Tapology, Matt, everybody's in agreement. Out of 599 votes, 93% going with Aspinall, 86% got him by knockout. If you look over at the odds, it's another one where it's overwhelmingly in the court of Aspinall. Open to -350, now -445 for his opponent, Alain Baudot. open to plus 250, now to plus 342. I think it's one that you fade anyway, but yeah, I'm going overwhelmingly with Tom Aspinall.
So, yeah, this whole card is full of a bunch of massive favorites and massive underdogs, and Tom Aspinall, it's hard not to side with the favorite in this. When you look at just everything as a pure skill set and kind of try to rank both guys at a 10, there's not many things Alain Baudot does better than Tom Aspinall. So for that, I'm going to have to go with Aspinall, because you really just have a really good technician over a guy with big power, and he is unorthodox, but those big looping shots, if you are a really solid and technical boxer, or really just striker, you're going to be able to kind of see your way through those, be able to dodge those big shots and land with your own. So I think it's going to be Aspinall. Probably he's going to run away with this.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to this fight. We both have Tom Aspinall to get the win. You're going to want to keep it locked in as we have an extended look at our main event between Magic Marlon Moraes and no nickname Cory Sandhagen. I'm really looking forward to it. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say. Let's get into it. If you're new to Fight Night Picks, welcome. Hello, I'm Craig Allen with Fight Night Picks. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Craig Allen FMP. I never start the videos off like that, but there's a reason why I'm doing it this time. Because insert the tweet from Max Friedman. Dricus du Plessis has been one of my guys. Now, listen, Matt, we always pick on these, prospects coming up through. We're big one championship guys. We're big KSW guys, big Bellator guys. Do we have the prediction videos for them? No, because not a lot of people are going to watch them. But
we're also very busy in our weekly.
In our spare time, we're definitely not missing a KSW card. And we're definitely not missing EFC as well. And the man on the right-hand side, so there's going to be a little bit of bias in this one, but Dricus du Plessis, if you haven't watched his fights and you're just going off our picks in the last 5 seconds, I implore you to A, watch the rest of this video, but B, go back and watch some Dricus du Plessis videos. I'll allow you now. If you need to pause it, go ahead, because this guy is one of the most entertaining fighters. And whether he wins by knockout or loses by knockout, and he only has 2 losses on his record, you're not going to want to miss this guy's fights. Now, it could have been at 70, it could have been at 85, it could have been at KSW, it could have been with EFC. It doesn't matter where it is. Very, very entertaining fighter is Dricus du Plessis. He has decent grappling to his credit. We saw it in the second fight against Roberto Soldic. Now, did he win that fight? No, he didn't. Do we have a video in one of our playlists where we talk about the best unsigned fighters that the UFC should sign? And in the thumbnail, it's Roberto Soldic? You're darn tootin' we do. But listen, Dricus du Plessis, when he came over, had that fight against Roberto Soldic. He had beaten Yannick Bahati that a lot of people knew with EFC. He was a champ there. He came in taking on KSW's guy, Roberto Soldic. And hey, Soldic, a guy that spent a lot of time training with TriStar MMA up in Canada, eh? You know them? And he has so many different tools in his tool belt, but it's his power and his left hook that really set him apart. Du Plessis gets the finish in the first fight. In the second fight, it's a knock him down, drag him out, slobber knocker of a fight. Soldic gets his belt back, and Dricus du Plessis took some time off, about a year. Then he took on Joelinton Santos that you might recognize from, listen, that guy's record is, I could just throw a scroll out there and you'd have to read off the list.
Well-deserved time off for du Plessis, because those back-to-back fights against Soldic will take quite a bit out of you, that's all.
So du Plessis gets a big win over Santos there with KSW. Then he has a fight back with EFC against Brendan Lesar. I mean, 3-0. It's a win to put on your record. A nice finish there. And that pretty much sets the stage for Dricus du Plessis. You know his grappling's half decent. He can wrestle if he gets into trouble. That's the thing. If he gets rocked, he's going to resort to the wrestling and the grappling, take it down to the ground. He has the ability to. And we've seen him get rocked before. Now, Roberto Soldic, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a guy that hits harder than that at 80. Really, in single shots, that guy is amazing.
Speed too.
Marcus Perez on the other side, that guy hits like a truck, and I know the UFC record's salty, but he has fought some decent competition.
So Marcus Perez kind of reminds me of Roberto Soldic, but for about 3 minutes. And this is my big problem with Marcus Perez. When you look at his skills, he's good on the feet. He hits quite hard. He's got pretty good output for those first 3 minutes. And he's good on the ground. But something, it's kind of a theme in a lot of his fights. The worst thing that can happen to Marcus Perez is him hurting his opponent early on in the fight. If he can crack you with a shot, he'll kind of burn himself out going for that finish. And then what already is somewhat questionable cardio, you can drain even earlier. Now, I'm not saying Dricus du Plessis should pretend to get rocked at the start of this fight and then potentially get finished, but if he can wear this fight on and really lengthen this fight, I'll let this be known right now. I think Dricus du Plessis, he's probably going to win this fight. And he's probably going to win by finish. But I do like that they're matching him up with Perez, a guy who, yes, in the UFC, like you had mentioned, he might not have lived up to what we really expected when he first entered. You know, those fun kind of face-offs he was doing where he'd paint his face like the Joker. But Du Plessis fought the best of the best outside the UFC. And no, he hasn't fought like a Douglas Lima, but the KSW, welterweight, middleweight, really just KSW as a whole. If you see a guy's coming over from there, it's not like they're coming over from like jungle fights or something. Like you can normally... It's normally a pretty safe bet when a guy comes over from KSW that they're going to at least do somewhat well in the UFC. I mean, look, Jan Blachowicz, he's a world champion now, and he went 1-1 with Sokoudjou over in KSW, so who knows anymore coming into the MMA. But I do think Dricus du Plessis, at his best, phenomenal striker, really good hand speed, can kick, can punch, can switch stances, but defensively he can kind of get worse. The more he switches stances, it's like he focuses on his offense a lot more than he does on his defense, and that can worry you a little bit, but I don't think Perez is the guy who's going to go out there and really make him pay for those mistakes, at least yet. I do think this is kind of a setup fight for du Plessis. And then going on into the future, I mean, there's so many fun matchups for him at 185 in the UFC, but I do see this more as a stepping stone for him to kind of move on to those harder matchups at 185, but I'm really excited for the future of Dricus du Plessis. If Perez can get the win in this fight, though, the sky's the limit, because beating a former KSW champion does so much for your career, and a guy who... I don't think Dricus du Plessis coming to the UFC is like an average guy coming to the UFC. I do think maybe not the casual fan knows who he is, but the hardcore MMA fans kind of realize what special talent is moving over to the UFC.
I'm going to compare him to somebody that I was really high on before he came into the UFC, and hopefully this comparison doesn't become a dud, and you can throw it on hot, ice cold takes if you need to. Here it comes. I mean, you know him from Ryzen. It's my guy, Yuri Prochazka, and that was a guy that there... He was taking on decent competition. Again, how good's Brendan Halsey? How good's Jay Kuhn? How good is CB Dollaway? Maybe not that good recently, but it's still decent competition to be fighting. If you're Dricus du Plessis and at least you have one win over Roberto Soldic, you told me something there. Now, did Soldic just, go in there, not ready, not trained? No, it was a good fight in the first one. But in the second one, amazing fight. Obviously, Soldic won out. So, realistically, Yuri Prochazka comes in, and they slot him in against Uzdemir at the top of the division. At least du Plessis gets a guy that's unranked, but you know who he is. And for Marcus Perez, again, last five, he loses to Anders, he beats Boknovic, he loses to Sanchez, he beats Hernandez, and he loses to Turman. What does that tell me? You're having a tough time. You're probably a 25 to 30 guy in a division that just keeps gaining. 85 just keeps getting better and better. And du Plessis has more than an opportunity to win here. Marcus Perez, decent on the ground. He can wrestle if he gets into trouble. The gas tank's a little bit of an issue, and he throws with a lot of power. He's a fun fighter to watch. Does Marcus Perez have an opportunity in this fight? 100% he does. I know we talked a lot about Dricus du Plessis. Go back. Our highest grossing video for the longest time was a KSW 45 fight companion. Dricus du Plessis fought Roberto Soldic on KSW 45. So, yeah, I mean, I know, again, I had to give you the intro, and you might be pissed at me now, but just hang in with us because we're having fun. I'm so excited about this fight. On Tapology at a 627 total votes, 75% going with du Plessis, 53% predicting him to win by knockout. The odds, I mean, somewhat surprising. Dricus du Plessis open minus 195. Money came in on Perez. Du Plessis right now minus 150. Perez currently sitting at a plus 125. Open as a plus 150 or thereabouts. It's a really interesting fight. Again, there's a lot of bias, so let that be known right now. But I do like Dricus du Plessis in this fight, and it should be fireworks.
Bias or not, it's not that I like Dricus du Plessis. It's just that Marcus Perez hasn't shown me enough during his UFC tenure. Beating UFC caliber guys that I would consider the Dricus du Plessis has beat outside of the UFC shows me a lot more than going 3-2 against, not really the highest level of competition in the UFC. I think Dricus du Plessis fought the better guys. I think he's the more skilled fighter out of the two. I do think he'll be able to pick up a win and probably even a stoppage one over the weekend.
2-3 in his last five, too. So, Matt, I mean, really looking forward to this fight. We both house South Africa's Dricus du Plessis. And I mean, hey, when can we get some more South African fighters fighting in the UFC? Let's get those EFC guys and gals in here. I'm really looking forward to this fight. We've got a great main event, an extended preview. Marlon Moraes taking on Cory Sandhagen. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with that, Matt. And as we always say with Fight Night Picks, let's get into it. Kevin Sataki's going to hate this fight, and hopefully he doesn't ref it. Or for your enjoyment, hopefully he does. We have Ben Rothwell taking on Marcin Tybura. And it's an interesting fight if it opened up the prelims maybe. This is on a main card. And wow, I've harped on this over and over again. We've had unranked heavyweights co-main eventing, and it was bad. Now, there's stylistic reasons as to why that was bad. Stylistically, this fight on paper is one of the more boring fights you can make at heavyweight, but you have to see these guys, and it has to happen. You've got Marcin Tybura that had a lot of success over with M1 Global. With the UFC, it's been so-so. He's won 2 in a row. Big win over Sergey Spivak. Big win over a short notice opponent who moved up in weight in Maxim Grishin in his last time out. That fight sucked.
It's rare Craig goes this hard on a matchup.
We did, again, all kinds of tape study. I'm very familiar with both fighters, but you go back and you watch that fight against Grishin, you thought, hey, the guy's long. He's going to throw nice kicks. We saw it over with PFL his last time out there. Had a lot of success. Beat Jordan Johnson. I mean, had good fights against him too. And that was a good litmus test because Johnson, you know the pedigree of his wrestling. So there was definitely an opportunity. And I saw a lot of people picking Maxim Grishin to beat Marcin Tybura. Now, the overwhelming wrestling and just the pressure from Tybura. He's one of those fighters that even in the Derek Lewis fight, you go back and watch that, and while he lost it and he got finished, he won the majority of the fight until he got finished. And for Ben Rothwell, he loses to Junior Dos Santos about 4 years ago, has a long layoff due to USADA complications, and then he comes back and drops 2 in a row. You're going to lose to Blagoy-Ivanov. It's tough to look good against Blagoy-Ivanov. Even Augusto Sakai beating him, look bad, especially with the fence grabs. Then Ben Rothwell goes out and he has a fight that I just scratched my head. It was bad. It was really bad.
That Oven St. Preux.
Well, the Arlovsky fight, sorry. So he loses to Arlovsky. Then he gets a win over a really tough out in Stefan Struve where Dan Miragliotta did most of the helping. And there were some nut shots. And I joke and I kid about that. But Ben Rothwell won that fight. All right, so what do? Well, they give him a guy that... Vince St. Preux, in a one-off at 265 where you worried about OSP. Like you did when OSP fought Menefield, it was boring until it wasn't, and he went full send. But Ben Rothwell, in that OSP fight, was just constantly in your face. The one thing that we don't get out of Ben Rothwell, and this would tickle Dominic Cruz's fancy, we don't get the herky-jerky movement. I'm sorry if you're watching on a phone or on your couch, that there was too much movement there. I'm sorry for your cat if you're cooking supper and your cat's watching. We probably threw the poor cat off. But in this fight, Ben Rothwell doesn't do what he used to do. Marcin Tybura still does. Does that matter here? I don't know, but this fight sucks.
Okay, wow. So Craig is not a big fan of this fight, and it's understandable. I'm going to try to break this down in a slightly more... I don't even really know. These two guys basically do the same thing. Now, I have been impressed with Marcin Tybura at some stages in his career. The first kind of run he went on before he fought Fabrice Verdum, I thought he looked really good. And the Luis Enrique win is always the one I go back to. And yes, beating Luis Enrique isn't going to tell you a lot about the person, but he knocked him out with a switch kick to the head. And that's just something you don't see a lot in the heavyweight division. Head kicks in general, really. And the fact that he was able to do that with that kind of speed from that one front leg. And I mean, front leg head kicks aren't something most people can do no matter what weight class, but for a heavyweight to be able to do that, I was really impressed. He even landed that same kick on Fabricio Verdum in the 5th round of their fight. So Marcin Tybura can be like really sneaky good in some parts of his fights. The Sergey Spivak performance I thought was actually really nice too, because I was high on Spivak coming off the Tuivasa win, which just shows how dumb I am, I guess, because I was really high on Tai Tuivasa at one point. But the way that Tybura was able to go out there and not just out-grapple another grappler, but really dominate him, I thought it was fairly impressive. Although the fight wasn't exciting, I was still impressed with his performance. Ben Rothwell in that OSP fight was just weird, because OSP, again, light heavyweight moving up, fighting one of the bigger heavyweight fighters, just stylistically, it was kind of a weird fight. And what's OSP going to do? Going to put his back to the cage and let you come to him. And that's what he did until Ben Rothwell would kind of get sloppy with his striking every now and then. And it just seemed like when OSP could land on Rothwell, he put him down. But Rothwell was just the overwhelming amount of volume. This fight's going to be a lot of clinch work up against the fence. And there's really no other way of putting it. I know Craig's making a big sigh because he knows I'm probably right in this. Because Tybura, he has good takedowns, but Ben Rothwell has good takedown defense. And it's kind of the same vice versa. Both guys I would classify as grapplers, but neither guy is... It's not like Tybura is way better at wrestling and Rothwell's way better at jiu-jitsu. Both guys are about, I'd say, like a 6 out of 10 at both. Now, Rothwell does have some really sneaky submissions, especially if people are shooting on him. The Josh Barnett submissions, one that a lot of people go back to, because he had that like weird guillotine from like his stomach. It was a really odd position, but submitting a guy like Ben Rothwell just really does tell me what level of a grappler you are. Although that was more of a defensive submission. This is something Dan Hardy talks about. There's defensive submissions and offensive submissions. Like a guillotine is a defensive submission. It's like a striker strikers are good at guillotines because they're used to people shooting for takedowns. They go for the guillotine. Whereas like Damian Maia, he's like an offensive submission specialist where he's going to go for the takedown, try to advance, and then get your back. Ben Rothwell's defensive submissions, I would say, they're not the best in the division because Fabricio Verdum is in that division, and same thing with Alexei Oleinik. But he's not in that god tier category, but I'd say he's that one step below. There's not a lot of submission threats like these two at heavyweight outside of those, Oleinik's and the Verdums. All that being said, this fight's probably going to be a draw. I can see a lot of 10-10 rounds just due to inactivity. I can, of course. I think Ben Rothwell is the better out of these two at striking. I do think the volume of Rothwell is going to be able to win rounds. Again, I'm not going to say this is going to be an exciting fight, but I do think Ben Rothwell has the slightly higher output out of the two fighters, and I don't think Tybura can hit him with a big shot to put him down. If OSP, now again, OSP, a light heavyweight moving up, but OSP's got some pop on his shots, and if he's not able to put Ben Rothwell down while hitting him fairly clean, I don't really see Tybura being able to, so I just think if Rothwell can keep the forward movement, keep his volume, and use a lot of that clinch work, I think he should be able to win what will be a very boring decision.
And listen, I mean, Matt, we've classified Marcin Tybura in an odd category that a lot of people disagree with us in the fact that he can be exciting. I mean, like, the kicks, some of the striking, it's a lot more single shots. Sometimes you'll see him just move in a straight line and just kind of throw the kitchen sink at you to initiate the clinch and then the takedown. So he's one of those guys. You see that out of a lot of people. They'll just rush in with a lot of shots. They get clipped sometimes, or they land into a clinch, into a takedown. They hit a double leg or single leg off the break. Now, in this one, we look at the votes over on Tapology. That's where it gets interesting. Out of 721 total votes, 56% going Rothwell, 57% saying he's going to win by decision. For Tybura, out of the 44% that are picking him, 78% saying he's going to win by decision. If we look up at the odds, they're close. Ben Rothwell, the favorite, opened as a minus, actually, 105. That line dropped immediately. He's now a minus 180 roughly favorite. Tybura opened as a favorite, minus 115, now at plus 150. And it's always interesting when we see a drastic shift in the odds. It's the second biggest shift to Tony Kelley, who actually shifted 59%. So this one, 41% in the favor of Ben Rothwell, according to Best Fight Odds. I always find that interesting. We've seen that a lot lately. It's been the fact that the odds are here, and then right off the hop, there's a huge drop. It's something that we don't see very often. You need to know that. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, it seems like every fight or every other fight, I have to mention it. There's a lot of things to dislike about this fight, which I might have set it off in a negative tone. But overall, I think the pressure and the volume of Ben Rothwell is something that we see time in and time out. It's tried and true. I mean, the striking numbers for both of these guys, actually, Tybura has a positive striking differential. Ben Rothwell is a negative. Neither one of these guys are going to wow you with a whole lot. Tybura possibly. Tybura has the better grappling stats. In just about every statistical category, Tybura takes over. Also consider the fact that Ben Rothwell, throughout his UFC tenure, as long as it's been, has fought really tough competition. Now, I know OSP blown up from 205 to 265 isn't great. Blagoy Ivanov's not bad. Arlovsky now is not great.
JDS.
The win before, I mean, JDS was years ago, but the win over Stefan Struve, it's not like the skyscrapers scraping skies these days. Or windows for that matter, maybe. But I have to reluctantly side with Ben Rothwell on this. I mean,
wow.
Yikes. This fight, oh boy. I'm just looking forward to the main event.
Craig hasn't gone this hard on a fight in a very long time. I do think Ben Rothwell, the things he does better than Marcin Tybura are the things that are going to give him the win. It's the volume striking. It's the clinch work. And again, neither one of those things always make for an exciting fight. I don't think, when I say volume striking, Ben Rothwell is not going to go out there like Yair Rodriguez and just start landing like different combinations and leg kicks. No, it's a lot of just, boxing combinations, move into the clinch, kind of move out. And it's going to be quite basic, but I do think Ben Rothwell is just going to be the slightly more active out of the two and be able to get the decision.
Matt, I'd be lying if I said I'm looking forward to this, but we both got Ben Rothwell to get the win, and hey, we are looking forward to a great and odd co-main event and a great main event. We've got Cory Sandhagen taking on Marlon Moraes. For some reason, you have Edson Barboza taking on Mr. Finland, Makwan Americani. So you're going to want to keep it locked in for that and the rest of the card if you missed out, because we're more joyous than this. And as we always say, Matt, keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. Let's get into it. Matt, this might seem like an odd fight in our co-main event, but it's an exciting one nonetheless. We have Edson Barboza taking on Mr. Finland, Makwan Americani. And Matt, for the MMA fans out there that are unfamiliar, go check out Makwan Americani's Tapology page. There are a few people with better pictures over there. After the playlist is done, after this video is done, go check it out. But Makwan Americani getting the short notice call-up in place of Sadiq Youssef at 45, getting an opportunity to take on one of the legends of striking in MMA, in Edson Barboza. And Listen, Matt, some people have wonderful highlight reels. Edson Barboza is one of them. And unfortunately, Terry Edom is on that highlight reel for not just Barboza, but for lightweight, but for UFC, but for MMA in general. It's going to happen over and over and over again. And Edom's going to wake up like a bad dream every morning going, I remember that time he flattened me out like a board with that crazy spinning wheel kick. Now, in this fight, Makwan Amirkhani, he can out jiu-jitsu the jiu-jitsu guys. We've seen it. He has a win over Jason Knight. Not a bad grappler. I mean, BKFC zone. You might think, hey, he's probably not good at it. But no, he really is. Just believe me. And he has a submission win over Chris Fishgold. And Chris Fishgold, very, very accomplished grappler. Now, has Fishgold translated from Cage Warriors champion to UFC hopeful? Well, he has, technically, but he hasn't looked as good in the UFC. But for Amirkhani, some big wins there. In his last fight, he picked up a really big submission win over Danny Henry, Scotland's own. So it just seems like he has a penchant for beating fighters out of the UK. In this one, though, I mean, Makwan Amirkhani, you're taking in such a tough out in Edson Barboza. And while Barboza in his last 6 fights is just 1-5, Matt, shall we ring off the losses?
Okay, so if you do look at Edson Barboza's record, it's a little bit deceiving because when you really analyze it, okay, so he lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov. And let's break down that fight really quick. Khabib beats the brakes off Edson. But here's the good thing if you do like Edson. In the 3rd round, he was still throwing flying knees and still trying to win that fight. And he actually kind of got better as the fight went on. It was weird. But Khabib beats him up. Bad stylistic matchup. Kevin Lee, again, just one of the better wrestlers you're ever going to come across in MMA. That was the first loss where I was like, okay, Edson probably should beat Kevin Lee. But everyone's going to remember, and I believe the 3rd round of that fight, he hits him with that spinning back kick and basically puts him on baby deer legs. But Kevin Lee, of course, able to get the knockout. The Dan Hooker fight was hard to watch. And I think extremely highly of Dan Hooker. I mean, look, he had that really close fight with Dustin Poirier in his last one, but Edson Barboza, one of the least competitive fights between like elite talent, I would say. And nothing against Dan Hooker. It's just Edson Barboza beat up his leg, his body, his head. There was really nothing. Dan Hooker didn't have an answer for the speed of Edson Barboza. And if you're dealing with a striker of Dan Hooker's caliber and he has trouble with a guy like Edson Barboza, I'm not going to give away my prediction this early, but just imagine how tough it's going to be on Makwan Amirkhani. And again, and then he loses to Justin Gaethje, no big deal in that, gets knocked out. Now, this is when it gets interesting, his last 2 fights. He loses a split decision to Paul Felder. Now, I had that fight for Paul Felder, but I'm going to be honest. The vast majority of people think Edson Barboza won that fight. And again, it's a loss on his record, but if you go by public opinion, a lot of people thought Edson won, and it was a close fight with a guy like Paul Felder, and people just know how good Paul Felder is. And then his last fight against Dan Ige. I don't know how Edson lost that fight. I gotta be honest, I've never seen a guy get a knockdown in every single round and still manage to lose a fight, because you have to remember, in the 1st round, he drops Dan Ige with an elbow. In the 2nd round, hurts him with a body kick. And then the 3rd round, I believe it was a leg kick, but maybe that was the round that he didn't actually get knocked down in. You can't drop a guy twice and lose a 3-round fight, though, when you drop him in 2 different rounds. I don't understand. I thought Edson won that fight. But again, look who he lost to. He lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov, Kevin Lee, Justin Gaethje, Paul Felder. I would say losing to those guys, there's no shame in that whatsoever. And then you move down in weight, your first fight at a new weight class, and again, I think you beat Dan Ige, but you lose a split decision to Dan Ige. There's no shame in any of that. And yes, something that we were talking about before we started filming, that's a lot of damage to take. You can't fight guys like that, throughout your whole career. And I think we saw it with, like, Tony Ferguson's a good example. You can't fight guys in the top 10 forever and just expect it to not take a toll on your body. And I think now we're starting to see that. With Edson, though, and this is something that Craig and I talk about a lot, Edson Barboza is not supposed to lose to a guy like Makwan Amirkhani. And I don't mean that as in any disrespect towards Amirkhani, but think about Edson Barboza and the caliber of guys he's beat. He's beat Anthony Pettis. He's beat Beneil Dariush. He's beat Dan Hooker. He's beat so many world-class guys that I don't see Makwan Amirkhani being able to go in there and go for his, a high volume of takedowns, really try to control Edson on the floor, and then seek out a submission. Because Edson, even off of his back, he's super explosive and really good at getting back up to his feet. He's got, I believe, Craig's going to have the actual stat, but a high takedown defense rate, I believe it's up near 80%. And when you fought guys like Kevin Lee and Khabib Nurmagomedov, and you're still able to have a stat that high for your wrestling defense, it just tells you how good Edson is. And I do think his movement has a lot to do with that, because again, we talk about this a lot. It's easier to take down a guy who's standing in kind of a boxing stance, just moving forward at you, than it is to fight a guy like Edson and take him down, who he's constantly going left and right, switching his stances and attacking your leg. And I do think that's going to be the big key to this fight. If Edson Barboza goes out there and takes away the front leg of Makwan Amirkhani, it's not that I don't see Amirkhani winning. I don't know what he does in this fight, because Amirkhani has that style. He is going to have that pressuring style where, I'm going to try to take you down. If you get back up, I'm just going to rinse and repeat. But Amirkhani doesn't really have the cardio of those other guys who've been able to do it to Edson Barboza. We saw that in the Shane Burgos fight. Burgos heavily invested in body shots, something Edson Barboza is very well known for. And you could see that as that fight went on, it really took a lot out of Amirkhani. And I think Edson Barboza can do most of the things that Shane Burgos can. Maybe not as much with the hands, but we do know how good Barboza's boxing is. And then just add in all those kicks. I think it's going to be a long night for Makwan Amirkhani.
It's really interesting because I was really looking forward to the fight with Sadiq Youssef. You've got two primary strikers. You've got power versus volume. Now, normally we say volume will always win out, or just about always, but I think Youssef would have made that a hell of a fight.
Power versus power, though.
I think it would have been a great fight either way. But the fight against Makwan Amirkhani, it's all right, I guess, in terms of matchmaking, but it's just a weird one. And Matt, you bring it up. I mean, both of these guys, it's weird, but they don't have positive striking differentials. Barboza's is negative by an ever so slight margin. 4.08 strikes landed per minute to 4.22 absorbed. His defense, 59%. For Amirkhani, 1.55 landed to 2.73 absorbed. That's not great. He's got a weird style when it is on the feet. He's a southpaw. You're taking on an orthodox fighter. He fights kind of long, too. It is awkward because you know that he's using that striking to set up his takedowns, and on average does land a lot more, about 3 more per 15 minutes compared to Barboza's. Now, Barboza, Matt, you bring it up, 80% takedown defense in the UFC. He has more than enough of a sample size that you can take all of those numbers into account. It's not like he has 2, 3, 4 fights in the UFC. Many, many, many. And in terms of Amirkhani, he's going to be fishing for the submission, trying to take it down. Dan Ige had some success with that. Dan Ige is a good wrestler. Makwan Amirkhani's more of, I need to get you down any way that I can. He's not a bad wrestler, but I really have to set up my submission abilities, whereas Dan Ige is going to try and work pass guard, try and really land some shots from the top. Amirkhani's fishing for that submission. So it's an interesting fight that way. If we look over in Tapology, out of the total votes is 701, 79% have Barboza, 65% have him by knockout. Now, I will preface it by saying, all right, there's probably a lot of Barboza bias in this one, and I'm sure that we're all guilty of it. There's probably a lot of people of you watching. You might be from Finland, you might be from SBG, you might be somebody that just really likes Makwan Amirkhani, and you might disagree with that. That's fine with me. If we look over at the odds, they're overwhelmingly in the favor of Barboza. He opened a minus 180 favorite. That line dropped quick. It pounced back up. Now, Barboza minus 255 favorite. For Makwan Amirkhani, opened as a plus 155. Now a plus 205. So the odds are in favor of Barboza. Now, Matt, yeah, we have to say, I mean, we both did have Barboza to beat Ige. I thought it was a close fight for sure. I am of the camp that thought that Barboza won that one, though, and it's not just due to the bias of the pick. I mean, go back and watch that fight, which, I mean, you have to if you're going to break down something like this. And it's just the level of volume and the fact that he was able to drop Ige at multiple points in the fight that you would think in close fights recently. Go back to the Josh Culibao fight with Charles Jourdain, same division. That first round was close. I thought Jourdain won it, and then in the last second and a half to 2 seconds, Culibao dropped Jourdain, and everybody says, overwhelming. All right, he dropped him. He won that round. The judges saw it for Culibao too. Every single one of them. And then as the fight teetered on, maybe it was some more Jourdain. Maybe it was closer for Culibao. Not that it matters all that much. It's just the fact that that late knockdown, and typically a knockdown, will sway the judges. But in that fight, it didn't.
And speaking of knockdowns, as I went for a very poor segue, Makwan Amirkhani got dropped twice by Jason Knight. Jason Knight dropped him twice. Edson Barboza hits so much. I can't even compare the two striking levels. And yes, Jason Knight, BKFC standout. But Edson Barboza is that different kind of striker where in MMA, I don't think there's many guys who would be terrified to fight. I think Edson Barboza is one of those few fighters who when you sign up to fight him, you're like, okay, like I'll do it, but no one's excited to do it. Because even if you beat him, you're going to take damage because of it. And again, Makwan Amirkhani is not this crazy explosive wrestler, and I think those are the guys who Edson Barboza has trouble with. If you're just a good wrestler, we were talking about this before, Beneil Dariush does a lot of things Makwan Amirkhani does, but he's a way better striker, and he wasn't even able to have much success against Edson Barboza outside of his jab and forward movement. And then Edson, who's such a smart striker, was able to time a jab into a flying knee because he knew that Beneil Dariush was going for a takedown after the jab. Because that's how high level of a striker Edson Barboza is. If he's able to read that on a guy like Beneil, he's going to be able to read that on a guy like Makwan Amirkhani. I'm not only going to say Edson by... I'm not only going to say Edson's going to win this fight, I think he's going to stop Amir Khani and get himself back on track. I'm really excited for Barboza at 145. I know he's a little bit later on in his career, and we might have seen the best days of Edson are kind of behind him, but I do think he still has a lot to offer to this really exciting division.
Man, I'm really looking forward to it. I have Edson Barboza as well. We're both in agreement picking the Brazilian to get the win. I'm really looking forward to this card in general, but our main event, we get an extended look at Sandhagen Moraes, top bantamweight honors, almost, and maybe a title shot. Aljamain Sterling's going to have something to say about that, but you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, and as we always say, let's get into it. Finally, time for our main event of the evening, Matt. At 135 pounds, we have the former World Series bantamweight champion, Marlon Moraes, taking on a really tough out in Cory Sandhagen. I say that, although Cory Sandhagen was finished in his last fight early on against Aljamain Sterling, a guy who deserves a title shot. Dana,
let's be honest.
Mick, everybody, Sean, book that title fight for Aljamain Sterling. Come on. Petr Sterling 2020 or 2021. We want to see it. But if this fight delivers, who knows? And for Marlon Moraes, he had that fight against Henry Cejudo that went great until it didn't. And that was the issue. But this is a guy that had 7 5-round fights with World Series in a row. As I said, the former champion. He had 3 main event spots in a row with the UFC. I mean, that Utica mainer against New York's own, and I get it. I mean, Jimmy Rivera, maybe not from Utica, but wow, did he not impress in that one? Silenced the crowd of, I mean, it was like, what, 6,500, and by that point, it was like 3,000. So there weren't a lot of people there, but the people that were sweeping up the popcorn enjoyed it nonetheless, and I thought it was great. It was a good win for Marlon Moraes. You know, in that first round to round and a half, you're going to get prime Marlon Moraes, a guy that's a Muay Thai black belt or Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He's dangerous everywhere, but primarily with his striking. And as everybody likes to say, every fight favors a striker when it starts, because every round starts on the feet. And that's the dumbest thing I might have said. But for Marlon Moraes, it's the best thing you can say, because opposite him, Cory Sandhagen, this guy, and Matt, we texted back and forth on the weekend. If there was an epitome of the word wonky, it's Cory Sandhagen. This guy's striking's weird. His jiu-jitsu's weird. Maybe his jiu-jitsu isn't to the same level belt-wise as Marlon Moraes, but oh boy, is it effective.
So Cory Sandhagen got submitted by Aljamain Sterling. There's no shame in that whatsoever. If you don't know how good of a grappler Aljamain Sterling is, I don't know what you're doing.
Get out of town.
Exactly, because Aljo, phenomenal volume, really good shot selection, and then once the fight goes to the ground, he can basically finish you. And I feel comfortable. He can finish you however he wants to, because he got a Suluev stretch over Cody Stamann, who's another top 10 guy, and that's one of the most rare submissions you can get in the UFC. That's how good Aljamain Sterling is. Now, I understand Marlon Moraes' belt is a higher level, like you were mentioning with Cory Sandhagen. Marlon's more... the second of Sunset fight's a really good example, because Marlon's submission game is normally, he's going to hit you with a big shot, you're going to go down, and then if he can't get the ground and pound off right away, he is good enough at jiu-jitsu that if he can find an arm, he'll go for it. If he can get your neck, he'll go for it. And that Sunset performance, the second one, was just so impressive, because it was a guy who, a lot of people thought Marlon won the first fight, a lot of people thought Sunset won their first fight. It was really, really close, and it was Marlon's first fight in the UFC, so you do have to take into account octagon jitters. Some people talk about a lot. And then, so he goes out there, has a really close fight with the Sun Sao. So you can't really tell much. You just know he's good, because the Sun Sao at that time, I believe, was ranked 3rd in the world. Then he goes out there, fights to another split decision with John Dodson. So again, we don't really know where Marlon is. And then he knocks out Aljamain Sterling. And then he knocks out Jimmy Rivera. And then he basically knocks out and submits a Sun Sao. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, he's the champ. Like, I can't wait for him to fight TJ. Because you have a guy with this crazy explosiveness, this super fast twitch, can throw all these different Muay Thai techniques, has amazing head kicks. And then that Henry Cejudo fight happened, and I gotta be honest, I haven't dropped stock in a fighter faster than I did for Marlon in that fight, because, and Craig and I argued about this a little bit before the cameras turned on, there's one thing fighters I don't know if they never get rid of, and this might be harsh on Marlon Moraes, but you just gotta call it like you see it. He kind of gave up in that fight. He was doing so well, and it's kind of what happened with Mike Tyson. You're doing well, and then you kind of face that adversity, and instead of just being like, okay, this is what it is, let's push through it, Marlon kind of wilted under that, and you can just tell with his body language. At the start of the first round, second round, he's all puffed up, he's like kind of cocky walking out there, but when the fight starts to get hard, you can see it. When he goes back to his corner after that second round, he's huffing and puffing for air, and Mark Henry's giving him a pep talk of all pep talks, and Henry Cejudo, the guy who's been getting beat up for the last 10 minutes, is still... He's clear-headed, he's talking to his coaches, and he's just figuring out, okay, how can I make this fight harder? And I don't know if that's something that, you have to just say, listen, Henry Cejudo arguably is one of the greatest fighters who's ever fought in MMA. He beat Demetrius. He's beat just so many great fighters. He beat Marlon. That maybe it wasn't that Marlon wasn't good that night. It's just Cejudo is so great. And I do understand that. But that's something that in MMA, when you see a guy kind of wilt under that pressure, it's a taste you can never get out of your mouth. And Cory Sandhagen, I've seen him get dropped in almost every single, or at least rocked in most of his fights, and it tends to be from one of the first 3 or 4 punches. I mean, the Alcantara fight's a great example. He gets rocked immediately, ends up on the ground in one of the worst positions you'll ever see, like mounted with a triangle and an armbar, and he works his way out of that position. So I know with Cory Sandhagen, no matter what happens, he could get dropped with a head kick. He's going to keep on fighting until he's completely out. I mean, here's a good example, and this is stupid because people think it's a description of toughness, but Cory Sandhagen didn't even tap when Aljamain Sterling choked him out. Like, he went to sleep. And that's hardcore. It just is. And Cory Sandhagen's skill set is a really interesting one to match up against Marlon, because Marlon is that tank. He's going to stand right there, march forward. He's going to throw really good leg kicks, really good power shots, and he is going to keep on marching forward until you give him a reason not to. And Cory Sandhagen, it'll be interesting because he can kind of play both games. If he wants to just stand there, kind of put pop in the end of his shots, his striking similar to Kevin Holland, kind of, where he's a longer guy for the division, but he's still got good pop. And then if he wants to, he's got that weird sort of Dominic Cruz. It's not as herky-jerky, it's a little bit more fluid, but he does have that really good foot movement, or footwork too, that I do think could give Marlon some trouble in this fight.
And you see fighters like that have a lot of success. Another one that comes to mind, not the herky-jerkiness, but Neil Magny's another guy. He uses his length well, he can push a pace, he can bring the fight to the ground, he can use his jiu-jitsu. Maybe we don't see it as much as we see the striking, but a very complete martial artist that understands his distance management. You see a lot of longer fighters, especially in the higher weight classes, where they have a significant reach and height advantage, and they can't use it. They have to get into the pocket and trade, and they have an advantage that they just leave there. It leaves, it's standing on those steps going into the octagon, and it doesn't follow them in there. And for Marlon Moraes, it has to be weird because you lose to Cejudo in a fight that you were winning, and then just dropped off a cliff in the 3rd round. So then you go in there and take on a legend. And I'm assuming it would be like if I fought George St. Pierre. Wow, I have so much pride for this guy.
Go well.
I grew up watching this guy beat some of the best in the world. I'm Canadian, he's Canadian. Holy smokes, let's share Molson after this one. But ultimately, I have to fight him. Marlon Moraes is going in there. You're fighting Jose Aldo, a legend of the sport. You can argue with me till the cows come home. I think Holloway's great, but to me, Jose Aldo, the greatest featherweight of all time. Now, Joe Rogan might not agree with me, but maybe you at home agree, disagree. Jose Aldo's great. Drops down to 35. Moraes beats him. You can make an argument either way. I thought that Moraes won that fight.
It was as close to a draw as you can get. Let's be honest. They fought pretty much par.
That's fair. It has to be absolutely demoralizing. If you beat a guy, he comes in off of 2 losses, albeit to Volkanovski and Moraes, and gets a title shot.
Now, I'm going to throw even more salt in the wound of Marlon Moraes. You know who he was supposed to fight before COVID broke out? Piotr Jan in Kazakhstan. That was supposed to be a main event, and in all honesty, the winner of that is fighting for a title, or the winner of that is champ by now. So he'd not only got the title fight taken away from him, the #1 contendership taken away from him, now he has to just fight Cory Sandhagen, and there's no promise of anything. Because if you beat Cory Sandhagen, yes, it's impressive, but you're beating a guy who another top contender has already finished in about the most impressive way possible. I don't think Marlon can go out there and knock out Cory Sandhagen, or even submit Cory Sandhagen faster than Aljamain did. And oh wow, Matt, you don't think Marlon can finish Cory Sandhagen in a minute? No, I don't. I think this is going to be a really competitive fight because both guys' strengths play into the other guy's weakness.
So it should be an interesting fight. Now, I put this one out there in the Fight Night Picks community tab section, so make sure you check that out. But I said, let's get into it. Main event banger at bantamweight. Who's getting the win? Out of 489 votes so far, this was 9 hours ago, 62% going with Moraes. But the commenters, and I see you out there, you're going with Cory Sandhagen. So let's look over at Topology, compare and contrast. It's about the same percentages. It was 765 votes, 68% going Moraes, 62% predicting a knockout. So then we look at the odds. Marlon Moraes is an underdog in this fight. Open to minus 135. The money came in quick on Sandhagen. So Moraes right now plus 115. It's moved around a little bit. It's coming down on Moraes again. For Sandhagen, opens plus 115. Now he's a minus 140. Now let's focus on Cory Sandhagen. We've talked a lot about Marlon Moraes. We're already 9 minutes into this video. Cory Sandhagen, like you had said, in that fight against Alcantara, and I know recently he just got released by the UFC because he's really old. He's not young for bantamweight. Yeah. And not everybody can be like a Sun Sao. All right, I get it. He got knocked out by Garbrandt in his last fight. But he defied the laws of age and time for a long time at the top of that bantamweight division. Not everybody can be a Sun Sao or a really tough out Masaranduba. Francisco Trinaldo, 55. It's just the truth. And for Sandhagen, he was in a compromising spot right off the jump, got out of it. He's faced adversity. He's faced top competition. And apart from that fight against Aljamain Sterling, where, I mean, you know, before that fight, Sterling had an opportunity at a title shot. After beating Sandhagen, I really think Sterling deserves a title shot. Dana White's basically just cucking this entire division by putting Jose Aldo into a title fight and continuing on as they have. But I think that this sets up a great fight. You've got Moraes, who's had so much experience at the 5-round level. Sandhagen hasn't, but trains out of a great gym where I think it prepares you perfectly for this opportunity. You've got Trevor Whitman and the gang in your corner. You're training at Elevation with Team Elevation, and Neil Magny was a name that I brought up earlier. And hey, I know it gets mixed up every now and again, but the team at Factory X and then the separate, obviously, team at Elevation, you have a huge advantage training up there in the mountains in Colorado. I mean, look at what it did for the career of Brendan Schaub. It worked out all right. He knocked out Mirko friggin' Krokop. So, in this one, maybe the level of pedigree of the belt of Cory Sandhagen isn't up to par with Marlon Moraes, but the guy has had a slow burn effect in some of his fights. In the Sterling fight, it was quick. We've gone over the odds, the fact that Sandhagen's the favorite now, but the fan vote is with Moraes. How do you see this one down the middle? Because there's a distinct path for both guys. Moraes, fast twitch starter, probably going to need to get it done early, but he has the experience in his back pocket. Sandhagen, boy, this guy is slippery. As we said, he's wonky.
So this is an interesting fight because it's not often you can say, I think Marlon can knock out Cory Sandhagen. I think Cory Sandhagen can knock out Marlon Moraes. Can Marlon Moraes submit Cory Sandhagen? Yeah, he can. Can Cory Sandhagen do the same to Marlon? Of course he can. Can both guys beat each other by decision? Probably. So they match up so well, and this really is just perfect matchmaking on the UFC. We can harp on them for the bantamweight division, kind of the weird flux that's in right now, but bantamweight is as exciting as any division right now, and I would argue that bantamweight, if you look at the top 10, it's basically just a bunch of guys you can match up, and there's a fight of the night going to happen. Because you have those names like Pedro Munoz, you've got Frankie Edgar's now in the mix, you've got Marlon, Cory, Sterling, Jan. Like, bantamweight's as good as any division in the UFC. I hate to say that if this fight ends in the first 2 rounds, it's probably going to be because Marlon won, and if it ends in the last 3, it's because of Cory Sandhagen. But I do see it kind of that cut and dry. Now, of course, it's the vice versa effect too, because these guys do match up so well. Interesting to note, Cory Sandhagen's so much bigger, just frame-wise. He is 5'11". He's basically just built like me, which is interesting, I guess. Because when you're that really tall, lanky guy using the footwork, I think it's worked out for Cory in a lot of his fights. But again, I keep on going back to the Marlon kind of giving up against Cejudo. I have to go back to Cory Sandhagen getting stunned in each and every one of his fights. You can get stunned by a guy like Yuri Alcantara. You can get stunned by a guy like John Lineker. I don't know if you can eat a shot by Marlon and just get stunned. I think you go down and stay down from those. It's unfortunate to say because I do really think that Cory Sandhagen has this super bright future. I know he's a little bit older for a lot of prospects because it seems like every time we talk about Cory Sandhagen, it's that, oh, he's that new up-and-comer, but he is 28 years old. Like, Robert Whittaker won the title when he was 26. Jan won the title when he was 27. So, like, he's a little bit older than, maybe the UFC would like you to think that he is, but still, hasn't taken a ton of damage, still young in his MMA career at least. I do think the future's bright for Cory Sandhagen. I think there's plenty of opportunity for him to win this fight. I just think the firepower that Marlon brings to most fights, especially at the bantamweight division, unless he is fighting a Cejudo who can just mix it up so much, unless he's fighting a Jan, will just be interesting because it's like 2 guys with 15 out of 10 for power, and we'll just see what happens. But I think Marlon stylistically is just a really hard matchup for Sandhagen. I think the leg kicks are going to be a big problem. Here's the thing, and this is kind of the caveat. If Cory Sandhagen can do 2 things, I think he can win this fight. If he can check leg kicks, which is a massive if, and then my other kind of side note, if he can cut Marlon early on in this fight, I think he can get at the confidence of him. It's kind of that Tyron Woodley aspect where Bisping talks about a lot on the broadcast. When Gilbert Burns first dropped Tyron Woodley, Michael Bisping just blew it out. It was like, oh, that's the worst thing that could ever happen. Because, like, once you get to these guys' confidence, it's really hard for them to build it back up unless they can land that big shot, see you hurt, and then they kind of get that rush back. I think if Marlon can just stay to his game plan, fight like he did in the Aldo fight, where he's a little bit more conserved, but when he really does have to sit down on his shots, he can always have that in his back pocket. So although my heart might be siding with Cory Sandhagen, my prediction is going to be Marlon Moraes. I just think the power is going to be too much for Cory in this one.
And I'm going to go with Moraes as well, and here's why. You can look at all the numbers that you want. Both guys have enough splits in the UFC that the percentages matter, but Marlon Moraes, slightly negative striking differential by decimal points. For Cory Sandhagen, 6.95 significant strikes landed per minute to 4.08 taken. So that's a good differential. The percentages for accuracy higher for Sandhagen. It's that weirdness, that wonkiness, but the volume definitely lies with Marlon Moraes. It's something you see a lot more. Like you said, the leg kicks, the kicks in general. This is a guy that can mix it up. He can switch stances. He can go to the legs a couple of times, and then he can switch stances and go high kick to the head. He can knock you out. He can do a lot of things where Cory Sandhagen, he's going to draw you in. I mean, you always have to worry about the takedown and the submissions, and he can set things up on the feet. And it's very rare for somebody to be that good at jiu-jitsu and MMA. We always used to talk about it with TJ Dillashaw. Is he the best pure wrestler? Is he the best guy with the best collegiate career? No, I mean, Ben Askren's one of the best guys, pure wrestling-wise, to bring it into MMA. But TJ Dillashaw, at a time, was probably the best wrestler in MMA, or the best MMA wrestler, and you saw it in a lot of his fights.
Don't all agree with that right away, but...
He evolved from collegiate wrestler to the poster child for Bang Muay Thai. And for Marlon Moraes, again, you've got the jiu-jitsu back in the back pocket. You've got the black belt in Muay Thai. For Sandhagen, you might not have a black belt in jiu-jitsu. You teach it. But you have the ability to set things up on the feet because people are going to be worried about the fact that you're such a good grappler. It's one of those fights that makes me just want to, again, I say this a lot, but you sit back with the pop and the popcorn, you enjoy it. But I'm picking Marlon Moraes in this fight. I think he has the opportunity to, again, stun early, hop on. Yes, Sandhagen could grab a leg. He could do something crazy. He could do that too. But I do think that Marlon Moraes has a good shot.
This has fight of the night written all over it, though. That's one of my guarantees. I'm not doing locks anymore because they're all wrong. But my locks for awards, this is going to be either performance of the night or fight of the night. I don't see how this can't be an exciting fight. Both guys move forward. Both guys are just amazing everywhere. And it's not like we say this a lot. Like, oh, they're well-rounded. But when you say that, we mean like they're like a 6 out of 10 at everything. These guys are both like 8 out of 10s. Like this is as high level as MMA can get. I'm extremely excited for this main event, but I am siding with Magic Marlon Moraes.
Matt, we are really looking forward to it. Both of us going with Marlon Moraes. And if you missed the rest of predictions, make sure you check out the playlist. Or if you're early in the week, the full card prediction video. And we've been toying with that. It seems to be working and people seem to be liking it. So we're going to keep doing that. You're going to see this out. This is coming out Tuesday night. We record Monday night. You're going to see the picks out individually later on in the week. And then on Saturday, we get an opportunity to recap with question mark kicks. A lot of you have been tuning into it. It was amazing this past weekend for Home Aldana, which was maybe not the best card on paper, but a lot of people tuned in. We had a lot of fun with that. We wore the denim on denim. You got to check that out on Instagram at Fight Night Picks. Lots of great fights on this card. Lots of sleepers that you shouldn't miss. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. And as we always say, let's get into it.